Buckingham Palace, often considered by many to be the greatest palace of all in London, and yet there's the Royal Palace in Madrid, Spain. So many palaces everywhere we go across the land. In India, although they tend not to call their palaces royal, and let's not forget the Great Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Going from St. Petersburg, Russia, though, to St. Petersburg, Florida, we see the modern buildings that we embrace now in our fifth-era civilization. And yet is there another mystery? Other objects and art that may indicate that something else happened in the past, from our current collective understanding. When we look across the land, we see many great ruins and monuments and mosaics that still remain. But we have to ask the question, are these the monuments and ruins in their authentic state, or have they been changed over time? And indeed, it is documented in official history that these monuments have been changed. In this exploration, we are going to look at many different mysteries. We're going to go underwater and look at ruins. We're going to look at different palaces. And in fact, we're just going to open it up to everything and even look at some artifacts that we haven't looked at. This is the exploration for everybody. Join me as we explore the greatest wonders of the land. We begin by examining the greatest palace in the land. And what is the greatest palace in the land? The Royal Palace of Caserta in the province of Caserta, Campania region of Italy, where Tiberius and some unknown guy on the right appeared. It was the brainchild of Emperor Charles III, who kind of reminds me of Pee Wee Herman, and that's a compliment to Pee Wee Herman because Charles III was a successful monarch. He teamed up with his architect Luigi Vanvitelli, who has this aqueduct named after him. He was a member of the House of Bourbon of Two Sicilies, and their sigil seems to have every other symbol on it, or coat of arms, whatever you want to call it. What is that's so impressive, though, about this Royal Palace of Caserta? Why is this considered the greatest palace of the land? Simply in terms of size. You're talking about a palace that covers over 1.3 million square feet. And you're also talking about very extensive terrain and garden projects. Now, this Luigi Vanvitelli was the architect who had teamed up with Charles III of Spain. There's many odd accounts, though, of this particular palace. For one, it was planned in 1750, and you can see with the expanse of the grounds that there was a lot of effort that was put into it. They inform us that this was to establish a palace that would rule an area that was difficult to rule. And so therefore, in 1750, old Luigi needed to set the conditions to do so. And this involved apparently moving an entire town or village to provide the labor. You may have seen this palace before. It was used as a filming location in Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. Ah, yes, the Star Wars prequels, which get a lot of criticism for not doing location shooting, and yet they went to some incredible, beautiful locations for the prequels. Doesn't this lion look interesting? Where have we seen this lion before in this particular pose? Usually it's associated with lions in what may be considered today Asia, but here we're seeing it in Italy. And why not have yourself a great, incredible theater that's stated to be modeled after many other theaters? This is all on this palace grounds, and from our understanding, they built this palace, according to the mainstream official historical account, to really be the one administrative center. They also say that it was really supposed to be a town within a town. All the functions of government in one building. Well, let's think about this. This was planned out in 1750. This was before the 7 Years' War. This was before the so-called French-Indian War, which was part of the same conflict in North America. And yet you have this royal family and this architect extraordinaire, who was an artist in his spare time, naturally, planning out this vast palace with this vast expanse of grounds to show their ability to effectively govern. But then there's another consideration. Why would you put all your eggs in one basket? Why would you put all your functions of government in one single building? Well, because it works. Why else? It's another example of the egg coming before the chicken. If you build it, they will come. If you build an incredible government building, then you'll have effective government. Why do you need to have a plan for effective government? Just build the building, right? And build the extensive grounds. And I really want you to appreciate that as you look at these images of just how extensive and expansive the grounds of the Royal Palace of Caserta really are. And if you have the means, I strongly recommend you visit this particular site on location, because the beauty and the opulence and the enduring materials of the construction are to this day. Now here's something else that's rather odd about this particular palace. You may have noticed that we've seen this particular pattern or this layout before in many other structures. Naturally, I'm reminded of the Vatican when I look at this, but this pattern appears in many different places across the land. I also want you to remember that in 1861, the nascent Kingdom of Italy, which had just been established, took an inventory of this particular palace. And oddly enough, when they came across the bidet, yes, that bidet, they stated that it was some unidentified object that kind of looked like a guitar. Isn't that odd? Merely a short 100 years later, and when they inventoried the contents of this palace, they had no idea what the bidet was or was for. It was almost as though you had an entirely new people that were finding more advanced technology. I know, it just reads that way. But yet you could understand why someone would actually think to use this palace for location shooting for a science fiction movie from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And yet that's exactly what we see when we look at this particular palace. You can see opulence and detailed construction. Now, it should be noted that naturally this is of course a World Heritage Site, because why wouldn't it be? And it's stated to be the swan song, or the very last example of the so-called Baroque, or as I like to call it, bark architecture. For some reason this particular fountain is giving me Legend of Zelda vibes, and I can't imagine why that is. So what's really going on with this opulent palace? Was this really constructed at the behest of a monarch from a particular royal family and his genius architect, whose only other project was this incredible aqueduct that bears his name? Or is there something more to this story? Why do we get the impression when we look at the facade of this incredible palace that it seems to be missing something? I don't know if it's just my mind, but maybe there's some way we can look at the actual plans of this original palace and see what was apparently intended. Or was it really a plan that we're going to look at? Or is it a recording? Because, yes, we have it available. And of course, when you look at this very impressive theater, this concert hall, whatever you want to call it, you could see that maybe they could have filmed other science fiction movies here, and other fantasy films. And isn't it odd that the original standard that was set in the Star Wars prequels is what the current productions strive to match? Where have we seen these symbols before? They appear all over the place. And when you look in other interiors of this incredible palace, you really get the impression that somebody put a lot of effort into it. Was it really the people of Caserta that constructed this palace? They were capable of doing all this in the mid-1700s, during the time before Mozart and other great composers, during the time before Napoleon? And indeed, if you think about that mentality of having all of your government functions in one single building, then perhaps you could understand why Napoleon was so successful. Well, except for that one time when he confused where the capital of Russia was. He thought it was in Moscow when really it was in St. Petersburg. Still, don't bother to explain that one. But back to Caserta, you can see some of the most impressive layouts of the gardens and the fountains. And so all this effort put into building this beautiful palace that Charles III, who had planned it with his architect Luigi, never even lived in, because he ascended to take over the Spanish throne at that time. And it should be noted that even though Charles III bears some resemblance to Pee Wee Herman, he was a very successful monarch. In fact, he was considered the most successful monarch of his generation. So, in addition to effectively administering Spain, he also worked with his architect to design this incredible palace that still stands to this day as a World Heritage Site. Oh, and by the way, before I forget to mention it, that aqueduct that we looked at earlier, that's also a World Heritage Site. So apparently old Luigi was really just a World Heritage Site builder, or architect. And on that note, old Luigi spent the rest of his life facilitating and constructing this palace. Although they do state that they had the labor of the town, the entire town that they had to move to provide labor to construct this vast and opulent palace, which is still the greatest in the land. 1,200 rooms. And just imagine that, over 1.3 million square feet. And what do these symbols actually mean in this particular palace? Do they have a meaning? Was this palace really built for an upstart royal family in an area that was stated to be difficult to govern in Italy? Or is it possible that this palace had an entirely different origin? That perhaps this is another one of these great compounds that we see that was constructed to survive some sort of calamity that came in the past? I think anything's possible when we look at it, and yet you can see in the designs and the patterns all over the palace, and the fact that once again we have the columns integrated with the walls. It seems to reflect some other designer, some other builder, somebody other than just some architect and somebody who wore leggings all the time. And look, I don't have anything against the style of leggings in the 1700s, but can you imagine a bunch of people working to lay out this impressive site? And by the way, how far do you think it is from the perspective of where this image was taken to the front facade of the palace? I'll let you in on something. It's a lot farther than you think. You get yourself a good workout running to the main door and back to where this image was taken. And yet we still see other similar patterns that we've seen in other strange locations. Now, it's still fascinating to think that when the Kingdom of Italy's administration inventoried this palace, that there were many objects they found in it that they had no idea what their actual function was. We always make the joke about the fact that there were no real bathrooms in old world buildings. But what about the lions? What else did they find in here that they had no idea what happened to it? Were there objects that were looted? Well, according to more recent history, this palace played a very prominent role in World War II and after World War II. And it was unfortunately bombed by Allied bombers, although apparently the damage was minimal because the palace is still relatively intact. And so what are your thoughts on this royal palace of Caserta? Do you believe that this is really the most impressive palace in the land? Or do you think there are other contenders for that title? It's certainly the largest, and so if we go by the largest in terms of area, both interior and exterior, there's virtually no comparison. Who really actually built these statues, and what do they mean? And how were they built? Do you believe they were carved, or were they formed with some more advanced construction process that may be beyond our comprehension, or at a bare minimum, at least beyond our knowledge? Looking at the grounds, though, of this palace, you'll find that it reflects beauty and opulence and an appreciation of art. Was it done as part of the Baroque or the Bark style, as I like to call it? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Now, let's take a look at Luigi's plan for this impressive palace. Luck would have it, we actually have a copy, or rather a scanned copy, of the proposal that architect Luigi Vanvitelli made for the Royal Palace of Caserta. And it's also stated that Charles III, when he saw this, was just so taken by emotion that he felt like his heart was going to jump out of his chest. And here's the cover of the plan, and you'll see that when you actually look at it, even the plan itself has a lot of artistic impression to it. Well, that's easy to explain. Luigi was stated to be an artist in his spare time, because being a master architect who could churn out World Heritage sites just wasn't good enough. And of course he incorporated art as part of his proposal. Imagine if we put this kind of effort into proposals today, whether they're corporate proposals or military concepts of operation. People just be taken by the art, and as you hear today, everyone's a visual learner. At least that's how it feels. What I find interesting, though, is just all the artistic impression that's used just to make this letter Q so impressive. And it even looks like we have an old world building behind it. And then looking further, you can actually see some other impressions that show old world buildings. You almost get the feeling that somebody already knew what this palace looked like. Well, of course, Luigi knew what the palace looked like. He had an image in his mind of what it was going to look like. And all he had to do was transpose that image to paper. Now, if you go through the rest of this and translate it into the current or your current preferred language, with your current preferred pronunciations, of course, you'll find that Luigi details his plan and outline. But he does have some nice pictures that we'll jump right to right now. And in these pictures, and let me rotate the screen so you can see it better, it looks like he laid out the palace, although oddly enough it does not include the entire layout of it. Now granted, we're looking at the immediate layout of the palace, and we see some interesting geometric precision. Now apparently this all came from the mind of Luigi, and he transcribed this on paper, including the layout of the floor plans. And isn't this very impressive that every single room was detailed? And I wonder if old Luigi knew that at one point in time when he designed this palace, it was going to be a filming location for the Star Wars prequels. Ah, yes. That wonderful standard that every Star Wars production today strives to match. That of the Star Wars prequels. But looking at the layout, you almost get the impression, and you have to ask the question, was this actually the design that was in Luigi's mind? Or was this a recording? Was this him sketching what he saw? And I ask that question because in this image here, we see this very impressive dome and these two towers. Now, officially, the palace wasn't finished because 30, 40 years or 20 years of the rest of Luigi's life as the great architect was not enough to finish it. Now, it's also stated that his son and others continued the project with all the free labor that they had at that time. But there's no dome and no towers, so apparently it was a tower too far for this particular palace. But what are your thoughts on it? Do you believe that it's possible that there may have once been a dome and towers on this palace, and through the ravages of time it was lost? I mean, there is an official historical account that Allied bombers hit this palace during the Great War of World War II and the vast conflict in Italy. Very interesting cross sections, though. And so it appears as though there was a lot more detail to this palace. But again, I have to ask the question, was there any planning or thought that went into the foundation of it? Where did all the materials come from? And my final question is, why is it that this royal palace of Caserta is holding up so well? We don't seem to have accounts of incessant renovation on it. And again, I'm given the impression, why would anybody do drawings like this for a design? I mean, maybe there's a reason, and I'm just asking a question. If you want to criticize me for it, that's completely fine. I'm merely pondering it. And yet it's odd that it seems as though you couldn't have this palace without this dome on it originally. They just didn't finish it. And that's what we'll be told. But as always, I leave it to you. What are your thoughts behind these drawings and these plans? Are these really plans? Is this a design? Or is this merely a recording of what somebody saw when they saw the palace for the first time? Why is it that when the Kingdom of Italy actually acquired this palace in the 1860s, they couldn't identify the mighty bidet? I mean, Crocodile Dundee eventually figured out what a bidet was for, but apparently they couldn't? I don't know. I'm not insulting anyone's intelligence. It's just very interesting when you consider these official historical accounts. What was really on all these grounds at one point in time? And why is this layout so extensive? Here we have horse and buggies in a mass procession proceeding right to the palace. A palace that was built for a monarch who never used it. What are your thoughts on the Royal Palace of Caserta? Let me know in the comments. This is our first look at underwater ruins on the channel, and I have looked at them in summary before, but I thought we'd take a more defined look because we haven't. But prior to looking at underwater ruins, I thought we'd examine this account of the so-called Acadian Civil War, which transpired in what is today Nova Scotia and on the eastern-western boundary of Maine. The reason this caught my attention is because one of the main posts that was a portion of key terrain or a primary objective during this Civil War, a civil war which was fought between two governors from France, interestingly enough, was named Port Royal, or Port Royal, or Port Royale. You know, we have so many different pronunciations. The actual boundaries of the French province of Acadia are quite intriguing because official historical sources tell us that they were never really well defined. And so even going right through the middle of Maine might have been considered the western boundary of Acadia. The point being is no one really knows for sure. And how odd that two governors would engage in a civil war. In fact, according to the official account, one of the finest combatants and leaders during the Civil War was one of the governor's wives, interestingly enough, Madame Latour, or the Lioness as she was known as. Apparently she led the defense in one of the final battles and was quite effective and successful. Perhaps someone should have put her in charge of the overall campaign and they might have won the war. This conflict was precipitated as a result of the poor division by the great Sun King himself, Louis XIV, who looks nothing like Leonardo DiCaprio, but, you know, we don't need to regale that particular movie. It wasn't too bad. But interesting that this failed policy from a great leader led to these two governors in a civil war. Now, of course, you also have the religious division. One governor was Catholic, the other was Protestant, and yet it's very odd that we have this account of this civil war occurring between two governors under the French monarchy. Another odd account, and of course it's 100 years before the account of the palace that we just looked at. Now let's go to our main source of exploration, and that's going to be Port Royal, or what is today Kingston, in the nation of Jamaica, in the Caribbean. Oddly enough, Port Royal was originally a pirate haven that went down after a 1692 earthquake. Yes, another one of these earthquakes. And most of Port Royal ended up under the sea. Yet when you look at some of these underwater ruins, you see very elaborate and extensive architecture that survives to this day. So I guess the conclusion we can make from this is, not only were cowboys wonderful architects and builders, apparently pirates were too. And look, if you're someone who enjoys cosplaying as a pirate, I don't want to rain on your parade. By all means, continue to be a pirate. I was a big fan of Captain Sabretooth back in the day, and if you don't know who Captain Sabretooth is, look it up. It's quite an intriguing account from Sweden. But looking at some of these photos, we do see some very elaborate underwater ruins. Now, to be fair, I have not actually dived and personally explored these myself. I would like to get around to it, but there's some very compelling images that show some very advanced architecture. Well, of course they had that capability. It was in the 1600s, and it was a pirate haven. And of course, pirates would build structures like this with very elaborate construction materials that still survive after a 1692 earthquake underwater to this day. So yes, you can venture to Jamaica and actually dive and explore these ruins. Now, other accounts say that they've reclaimed some of these particular ruins that are underwater, but it's quite compelling because you really again have to ask the question, is the official historical account correct? Is it telling us what really happened? Is this what Port Royal looked like back in the day? And I'll admit that, yes, I played Pirates on the Nintendo Entertainment System back in the day. It was actually one of my favorite games, back when I was more from a, well, maybe I shouldn't say any more than that, but it was quite compelling when you had these stories and these narratives. And indeed, I can understand why the story of Captain Sabretooth is so compelling. Yes, this was even before the days of Cutthroat Island. What a successful movie that was. The less said about that, the better. And of course, before the widely known Pirates of the Caribbean. But what really happened to this port? Was it simply flooded by an earthquake? Was it an earthquake that created a tsunami? Was it a series of disasters? Indeed, on the ground, elaborate structures still survive to this day. So again, if the official history is correct, we have structures that are hundreds of years old that survive, that were built by pirates apparently. Now, yes, I'm jesting, of course. I'm sure that the pirates captured, found architects, and then the pirates are able to find labor. Yes, here you have the Royal Artillery Store, apparently. Very well-constructed Royal Artillery Store, and we've certainly seen that arrangement of blocks above the doorway in many places, haven't we? And what kind of bricks are those? Well, obviously they weren't the bricks that were made in St. Louis, although if you talk to some people, you would think that every single brick was actually made in St. Louis, even before St. Louis was settled. What's really the truth behind these underwater ruins, though? Are these the remains of Port Royal as we're told, or are these the remains of something else? Some foundation civilization that might have been destroyed in some sort of calamity, or some other sort of disaster? Or I always leave the possibility on the table that the mainstream account is exactly correct. But you don't really hear many direct allusions to this fate of what actually happened with Port Royal. And I'll be honest, even in all my studies of history back when I was teaching full-time, it was something that tended to be glossed over, basically something that was stated once. Well, Port Royal was destroyed in an earthquake, and that's why you don't have this once marvelous pirate haven that was there, where Captain Sabretooth and Jack Sparrow actually hung out. Yeah, I know it's not Tortuga, but whatever the case may be, though, you have these images, these drawings that show you that this was a very well-constructed city, and it had to be because we still have evidence that's under the water, and we still have this very well-constructed artillery store. Tell me, why exactly would you need to put that kind of decoration on it? I can completely understand why you need to build your artillery dump to withstand attacks, explosions, mighty cannons, and everyone having exploding cannonballs, which apparently they had back in the 1600s. And by the way, I recall someone informing me that the whole reason that star forts took off in the 14 to the 1500s was because there was no weaponry that could actually lob rounds in an indirect manner over the walls of the star fort. Except, of course, for the Ottoman Empire, which possessed what are today called mortars, and they could actually lob rounds over the very impressive star fort. So, why would they build a defensive fortification that was ineffective? I guess it was just the thing to do. Again, one of those questionable things in mainstream history. And sure, maybe someone could have made a repeated military mistake for hundreds of years. It has happened. But what exactly is the account of where these materials came from? Were they actually all found on the island? Was this place constructed according to the mainstream account? Or is this the remnant of some other lost civilization that we are completely unaware of? And that's always the difficulty when things are underwater. You don't have the capability to assess things as easily as you can when they're on the surface. But it's not to say that these ruins are any less compelling. And indeed, there are numerous documents that indicate that these areas have been excavated, that some structures have been very thoroughly surveyed, and old Port Royal, Jamaica still survives to this day. But what other secrets, what other clues might be under the water that you can explore to this day? I strongly suggest if you have the means to go visit this area and be aware of it. Perhaps there's even some remains that are more elaborate than what you see in this image. Perhaps there's even something that can't be explained so easily. Sort of like a bidet that somebody says is a strangely shaped guitar that we don't know what its purpose is. I mean, would you know what the purpose of these structures are? Do we have an idea? And we go to what is today Egypt, and we have that account of the great lighthouse of Alexandria. Ah, yes, Alexandria, the great port city from the distant past in the wondrous era of Hellenistic studies. The lighthouse, the Library of Alexandria. And why are we focusing on this? Well, there's a lot of allusions to the Lighthouse of Alexandria as one of the 7 old wonders of the world. We've looked at it in passing, and we have numerous different artistic depictions that give us the impression that this lighthouse had tremendous capabilities. And indeed, if it was actually referred to as one of the old wonders of the old world, funny they say it that way, and there are many different artistic renditions of it, then it truly must have been a spectacular structure. How tall was it? What was it constructed out of? And why do we still have so many references to it to this day? Well, there'll be the usual historical documentation of how some things happened and some things didn't happen. Yet, oddly enough, there are many ruins that are right nearby where the lighthouse of the Pharos actually existed. And so, again, what's really going on here underwater? Do we actually have these elaborate and extensive ruins? And you might be surprised because some of these images and some of these diving expeditions do reveal very large building blocks and some very dramatic examples of ruins from the distant past. Now, is this really from the civilization of a Hellenistic time or the early days of the Roman times? It's really hard to say, because what actually happened to that library in Alexandria? What are these figures really of? And what are they supposed to represent? Is this yet another version of something happening where someone made a bunch of statues and then it was just simply flooded? It simply fell into the sea? And of course, that's what the historical account will tell us, or it was some sort of natural disaster or some compilation of disasters. And yet, when you look at some of these images, you can find very well detailed figures and very colossal remains that are underwater. And so that's where we really have to ask the question. There seems to be a lot more than meets the eye. And recall that these are more easily accessible areas that are underwater. What about the deeper reaches or the hard to access portions of the sea or the oceans? And how deep are they really? And that's a question I'm openly asking because, yes, of course, we say that we have scientific instruments that can measure the actual depth of the oceans, and they may well be correct. But is it possible that there could be some areas of the ocean that are much more difficult to access for a variety of factors? And could it also be possible that there's even more dramatic ruins that we haven't actually seen or haven't come across yet? Because there are many disasters that we haven't actually solved that occurred at sea. Lost planes and lost ships. Too many accounts to recall here. But when you look at some of these images and you see the size of some of these figures and just how impressive the detail is, and keep in mind, how long have these been underwater? What exactly were these made out of, and how were they constructed to stand up so well after all this time? It brings about so many questions, and we have to consider the original account of the lighthouse in Alexandria. What was the actual chronology behind it? How long ago did it happen? Was it really 2,000 years ago? Was it much closer in time? Was it much further in time? Both possibilities could be true. And finally, the third possibility, that it is as they tell us. But again, I have to ask, is that really how it goes if we're so certain about things? Because how long does paper last? How long do records actually last that are recorded on paper? How is it that we have a complete copy of the original plan of the Palace of Caserta, which wasn't even 300 years ago, as of yet, and yet does the book last that long? And of course you can say, well, it's simply because they made copies of it. Ah, yes. And when they made copies of it, did they copy it in perfect detail? Or could things have been changed? Could things have been changed because perhaps there was a new society that was different from the older society? And we go to China. And in China, they have their own underwater city or underwater remains. And this is the specific location of it, and perhaps you've heard of it before, or maybe you haven't. And I intend to do some focused explorations on China because there are a lot of details there that we can look at. There's a lot of intriguing mysteries, the least of which being the more modern, rapidly built cities that they have in China. There's also numerous replications of what we would consider old world architecture. Of course, that's going on all across the land. And this ruins that you have beneath these lakes here in China. Ruins that, again, are underwater and show a spectacular knowledge of construction. Ah, look at that. There is that lion again, even in that same pose. So I just wanted to show this to show you that we have this well-known lion in China, and it also coincidentally appears in Italy, completely on the other side of the land. What are the odds? And when you look in more detail at these underwater ruins, you'll find that there is no shortage of detail. But what are your thoughts on this? Do these reflect previous lost civilizations, or is it all very well documented and we know the story and shouldn't be asking questions? Let me know in the comments. Again, we start by looking at the Pantheon in Rome. Now, the mainstream narrative tells us that the Pantheon in Rome was originally constructed by Agrippa, who was Augustus's right-hand man, and supposedly it was constructed right around 27 to 16 before Common Era, depending on the dating system, depending on dates. And of course, you know what we think about dates and timelines. They are very, very fluid, and we're going off of a timeline that could always change. The Pantheon was supposedly rebuilt by Emperor Hadrian around 130 to 136. And again, the mainstream account makes it very clear that they don't know when he rebuilt it because they said that Emperor Hadrian did not have an inscription put on the building. How inconvenient. But convenient for our purposes because this opens up the questions that we ask with this exploration. What makes the Pantheon so extraordinary anyway? Well, the mainstream tells us that it is the largest continuously poured concrete and an unreinforced concrete dome in the world. And it has an oculus in it, which is the opening that you see up here. This is the oculus. And we have no means to reconstruct this to this day. What does this really tell us then about the capabilities of those in the past? We'll be told that Rome was a very benign empire when it came to its architectural achievements, but then we'll also be told that it was very corrupt and ruthless when it came about to its civil society. We always have that dichotomy when it comes to looking at civilizations of the past. They could achieve great architectural feats, and yet at the same time, they were ruthless to their people, and they deserved to fall and disintegrate as they did. It's a recurring theme. However, when we look at the cross-section of the Pantheon, we see that a perfect sphere fits within it. The design is something that completely defies easy explanation. And as the mainstream admits to us, this is not something that we could do today easily. And in fact, not at all. Of course, they would probably tell us, well, with the right money and the right contractors, anything could be achieved. But is that the reality behind it? There's all the stories about Roman concrete and concrete in many locations across the world where we see incredible detailing. You see it in the Pantheon, you see it in many temples in India, and we will be coming across a temple in India that we'll be exploring today. It's the same story though. A very detailed mix of different types of concrete. Now we're not going to talk about the types of concrete today. That warrants a video in and of itself, the various types of cement that we have. However, it becomes very clear that based on what we're told, the historical account admits that the concrete available to the Romans and to the builders of the past, regardless of which civilization and where they were located in the lands, is vastly superior to what we have available today. They did not need to reinforce it. And here another look at the oculus. But there was something I wanted to point out to the Pantheon. I have had the pleasure of actually being on the ground there, although it was some years ago. Just to give you an idea, it was long before people had iPhones. And I'm usually loath to use Google Maps to conduct explorations, but based on my memory and talking to a few friends, I think that what they depict on there is more or less accurate, and it can share some of the points I would like to illustrate to you about the Pantheon. When we look at the aerial imagery of the Pantheon in Rome, there is nothing that seems to be extraordinary about it. It fits in with the other buildings very well, and that's always one of the challenges with aerial imagery. But when you get on the ground, you see a slightly different picture. And actually, being on the ground, you get the impression immediately that the Pantheon is set lower in the ground than the surrounding buildings. It's almost as though they've dug the Pantheon out. One of the other remarkable features you'll notice is the fact that the Pantheon appears as though people can just go right up to it. And I remember going there, and again, this was some time ago, before everyone had iPhones, or really anybody had iPhones. And I found it an interesting facet that vehicles could park right up next to the Pantheon. Well, I guess they weren't worried about emissions or anything, causing this amazing piece of history to be lost at the time. When you go around the outside of the Pantheon, aside from the fact that it looks like it's deep in the ground, there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. In fact, it has a similar construction and appearance to the Aurelian walls, and that was something that stood out to me at the time. Yet when you get a little closer on the outside, you can notice the details. And when you go all the way around it, you do notice that people can walk right up to it. And that's always been the case as far as I know. Now, who knows what it may have looked like in years past or what we may have seen. You can sit right up behind it, and yet at the same time, you do get the hints of more remarkable construction on the outside. And for those new to the channel, I have my 3 primary adjectives: amazing, remarkable, and extraordinary. Okay, great. The Pantheon is what you consider something lower in terms of your assessment. No, that's not the case. As with many other wondrous buildings, it's not the outside of the Pantheon, it's the inside of the Pantheon, where you really find the actual achievements and the extraordinary appearance of it. You look at the floor, you look at the columns, you look at the incredible construction of the ceiling and the oculus and the detail. Mainstream accounts tell us that this building is anywhere from 2,000 to 1,800 years. They don't know. They even say that they don't know. If you ever have the means to go to Rome and go to the inside of the Pantheon, you will quickly find yourself overwhelmed by extraordinary feelings looking inside of it. But there's something then about this building that relates back to my more recent explorations. I remember thinking at the time, this was early 2000s, that there was never a building like this anywhere else in the world. I was fortunate to be standing there. And yet just earlier this year, when I went to a state capital in a Midwest state in the United States known for its incredible corn, I saw many of the same detailings in that building. And that was the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines, Iowa. It's a very fascinating consideration when you can start to see similarities in the construction in 2 buildings that are supposed to be separated by over 1,000 years in two entirely different parts of the land. So, with that, we leave the Pantheon. It is one of the most extraordinary examples of old world technology, the finest. We go to the very consideration of Roman roads, another incredible achievement that defies extraordinary considerations with their construction and their duration. I think all of us can look around wherever we are in the land and we see constant repaving efforts going on, whether it's in our town or on our local highways. And some places in the United States, it feels like they're working on some sections of road almost every other week. In fact, there's one section in Wisconsin where I think they've been constantly working on the interstate for 10 years continuously, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. The Roman roads, we're told, had methods of construction and materials that were available to the Romans that we do not have today, and that is why they endure still. Now, yes, you look at the Roman road here in this picture, and it may not appear perfect, but the fact that it's still there, and the fact that it still has a more or less level surface after all this time, is extraordinary, beyond simple words to describe. And we ask ourselves the questions, well, why can't we build enduring roads like this? Why can't we have superhighways that will last? And we'll be given the usual explanations. We lack the resources, namely money, although we can continuously go further in debt without any consideration, it seems. So why would it matter? Why can't we build roads like this? Wouldn't it ultimately save money on a long enough timeline? Moving on to the Lycurgus cup. The Lycurgus cup is an old Roman chalice that seems to be the first example of nanotechnology in the world from the 4th century CE. Yes, after that crisis situation in Rome, things were just appearing very hunky dory. The crisis of the third century is the mainstream historical account where Rome was mired in civil wars for nearly 100 years and had numerous what they called barracks emperors, or the army decided who was being emperor. There were relentless barbarian attacks, and the empire very barely survived. Yet, it seems that all this terror and uncertainty and oppression once again inspired creativity and incredible technical achievement, defying the explanation of extraordinary. The chalice appears to change colors depending on the direction of the light that hits it, ranging from jade green to blood red. It appears that the chalice contains ground gold particles, smaller than 1/1000th the size of a grain of sand. Well, at least they didn't say 1/1 billionth, right? Made with mind blowing precision. They do admit it continues to baffle scientists to this day. So the mainstream is being somewhat honest that they can't easily explain this. Yet here we have an extraordinary achievement of the past and a fine example of old world technology. And now the dodecahedra, made of copper alloy, which has been cast into a regular dodecahedral shape. They rarely show signs of wear and do not have any inscribed numbers or letters. Two dodecahedra and an icosahedron on display in the Rheinschutz Lancium Bonn, Germany. The first dodecahedron was found in 1739. Strangely enough, there's been no mention of dodecahedrons in contemporary accounts at the time. The only thing they tell us is that they believe they came from the same time frame that the previously shown Lycaris cup came from, and supposedly these were Roman. What possible purpose could these have had? And this is something we speculate on. Could these have potentially been devices that were used for some sort of great technological advance? I'm reminded of the very poorly written yet visually beautiful movie Prometheus, where we saw that the cartographer they had along with them had pups. And they were just little miniature drones that actually could operate on their own without an operator, unlike all the drones we have today. And they were capable of flying around and creating maps of certain areas. Now, it may not be something so extraordinary for these little dodecahedra. However, what's the explanation for what purpose they could have possibly served? It's yet another anomaly in these accounts that we have, and I suspect there's something far more amazing behind their original purpose. But let me know what you think in the comments. Are these just some sort of decorative devices that didn't really serve any purpose and they were just made to adorn your fence or sit in your garden in Germany when you weren't fending off all the raids from the evil barbarians? Or was this really something with a greater purpose? We move on to the stainless steel, which was invented in 1913, which is why scientists continue scratching their heads over the Iron Pillar of Delhi. Constructed sometime between 375 and 415 CE, this massive iron pillar measures 7.2 meters high and weighs over 3 tons. Despite years of rain and wind, it has never rusted. Theories imply that the pillar was created in 3-phase process that created a protective coat over the surface. So we're looking at continuous pieces of technology that defy explanation even from the mainstream, and the mainstream doesn't even attempt to explain it. And that's the reason why I've picked a lot of these objects or these devices or these examples of technology. They don't even try to explain it because they can't. Now, what do we think this could have been? This Iron Pillar of Delhi? Could this have been a surviving example of an old world structure that, for whatever reason, was not subjected to the effects of the resets in the past? Possibly. Could this have been something that was chosen for preservation and still stays with us today from those who wish to take care of whatever technology they could salvage from previous resets? That's a possibility as well. I leave it to you and let me know what you think in the comments on this one. The Dynasphere was a monowheel vehicle design patented in 1930 by John Archibald Purves. Purves' idea for the vehicle was inspired by a sketch made by Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci is quite an anomaly in and of himself with all the incredible designs that he had, and yet it seemed to be sort of a bridge between what we were told was the Renaissance, and yet at the same time, the Renaissance seemed to introduce old world technology to the contemporary world. The Dynasphere model reached top speeds of 25 to 30 miles per hour, 40 to 48 kilometers per hour. The gasoline powered prototype was 10 foot high and built of iron latticework that weighed 1,000 pounds. The next generation version had 10 outer hoops covered with a leather lining shaped to present a small profile to the ground. So imagine in the 1930s, during the Great Depression no less, you suddenly had the capability to travel anywhere at any time. Does this kind of vehicle look like it would be limited to just staying on road surfaces? Maybe. Could it have had additional capabilities that we were not aware of? This seems like something that is a prime example of extraordinary old world technology. Imagine having the ability to have a vehicle that you could jump in and go any place, anytime. What if it wasn't even limited by the terrain? It could ascend any hill, it could ascend any degree of inclination, and you could go anywhere easily. Suddenly, you reduce the considerations of traffic. Of course, we're told by the mainstream that this was not considered a viable design because of the fact that you were exposed to the elements. Of course, we overlook the fact that the original cars made at the start of the century were exposed to the elements as well, and just a few simple adjustments, and you're no longer exposed to the elements. Strangely enough, on this picture, it looks like they've solved that as well, and yet still, this was not considered a viable design. Stunning. And now we move to the example of Greek fire. And this is one example that I'll be using a mainstream account on, and sometimes I do use mainstream accounts, because remember, the mainstream account is telling us what the official position on something is. And of course, it could be different tomorrow. Sort of like if you look up what plate armor weighs, and they tell you today it weighs between 45 to 55 pounds, but then next year they could tell you it weighed between 25 to 35 pounds. It's interesting if you look at older books what they tell you about the nature of armor. Regardless, Greek fire was an incendiary weapon used by the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, beginning AD 672. Used to set enemy ships on fire, it consisted of a combustible compound emitted by a flame-throwing weapon. Extraordinary. Some historians said it could be ignited on contact with water and was probably based on naphtha and quicklime. The Byzantines typically used it in naval battles to great effect, as it could continue burning while floating on water. The technological advantage it provided was responsible for many key Byzantine military victories, most notably the salvation of Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, from the First and Second Arab sieges, thus securing the empire's survival. The impression made by Greek fire on the Western European crusaders was such that the name was applied to any sort of incendiary weapon, including those used by Arabs, the Chinese, and the Mongols. Of course, we have to obfuscate the account. However, these mixtures used formulas different from that of Byzantine Greek fire, which was a closely guarded state secret. An intriguing concept, and doesn't it sound quite familiar to the concept of wildfire for those of us familiar with the Game of Thrones series? So it's clear where George R. R. Martin was inspired. The very premise of Greek fire is extraordinary in and of itself. Imagine a weapon with the ability to induce incineration. It truly would have given a decisive advantage, and the mainstream historical accounts tell us it gave the Byzantines a decisive advantage. Although who knows what the reality behind it was and who actually used it. It's clear that enough accounts survived of it that the mainstream has to address it. Still, it's an extraordinary piece of old world technology, and it's something else we cannot replicate today. Oh yes, of course, we're told that we have napalm and we have modern military flamethrowers. But I really wonder if they compared to the capability that Greek fire brought about in its day, especially when we consider about its effects on water. And many images of it persist to this day. And here, one of those major battles from 717 from the mainstream account in Constantinople, what is now Istanbul. And we see the Hagia Sophia in the background. Remember, that building built in 536, the worst year in human history, but it did not stop the construction of one of the most amazing edifices. I even recall corresponding with a few friends who were gamers, and there was even a Greek fire infantry unit in the game Total War. extraordinary considerations for such a weapon, and what's the true nature behind it? How did they create Greek fire, and what true decisive advantage did it give them, and what uses did they have? I invite more feedback in the comments on this, as this is an extraordinary piece of technology, even if it was used in a more pernicious form. We also have other examples of things such as the punt gun, and this goes back to our very large no dachi samurai sword from last week, because it's another example of something that seems to be scaled, let's just say, for people of a different stature than ours. The mainstream will tell us it makes sense. You could bring down a lot of fowl with a single shot, although when you look closely at the trigger, you see that the trigger itself has to be rather large itself. Well, I guess you need to know that you're pulling the trigger of a very large weapon. How practical would this have been to carry around, and are these easy explanations? Or is this another example of extraordinary old world technology that we have pictorial evidence of? We move on to cannons. And I haven't really covered cannons yet on the channel because they warrant their exploration of their own. We're told what they were used for, military purposes, and there are many theories that they had entirely different purposes, especially with the cannonballs and the vast compilations we see of cannonballs with cannons. We also considered the logistical difficulty in moving this kind of heavy equipment. And the logistical difficulties are a consideration that oftentimes elude us because when we're just trying to explain how armies got to the field and fought, we oftentimes overlook the ability to sustain them with logistics. And how difficult would that have been in the past, at least if we go off of the mainstream account? Regardless, cannons could have many different functions, and we don't know whether they serve some other purpose. Were they part of an old world construction? Were they an old world weapon? Or did they have some other purpose that completely eludes us? We've many historical examples of these great cannons, the Great Turkish Bombard and the unique names that they had for them. But how practical would it have been to lug these things around and to transport them? Would it have been easy to just pull them with many beasts of burden? You've got your 300 oxen ready to go to pull your cannon across the ground. Can you really put it on a wagon if it's as heavy as they told us that it was? Or one of these cannon balls that may have weighed 1,000 pounds apiece? How practical would that have been to transport logistically? And I'm sure there's plenty of naysayers out there that'll say, well, it just required more manpower and it just required effort. Yes, that's the answer to everything. But I invite you to let me know what you think in the comments about it. The intriguing thing is that it's very rare that cannons, in historical context, provided decisive victories in battles. We look at the more modern example of the German cannon, the Heavy Gustav, and yes, I'm saying it in English because I'm not going to butcher the German of it. But the Heavy Gustav was a railway cannon that was constructed for the Third Reich in World War II, and it could shoot 800 millimeter rounds, depicted here to the right. And even with the fact that it was transported on rails, how practical was it? And did this weapon provide a single decisive advantage in a single battle? Not really. Supposedly it was originally constructed to help the Germans penetrate the Maginot Line, even though they simply went around it, so the historical accounts tell us. Although in the Battle of Sevastopol in the siege in 1942, when Erich von Manstein's 11th German Army was besieging Sevastopol, they did bring in this railway cannon, and supposedly it knocked out this large Soviet Maxim Gorky redoubt here, a very large gun that was supposedly a fort with 1,000 soldiers inside of it. Nevertheless, there are few accounts of the use of this incredible weapon, strangely enough, and it still required 11th Army to go in with infantry and seize Sevastopol. So it's another example of an incredible weapon not having a decisive effect on the battlefield, unlike Greek fire. Finally, there's the consideration of Saddam Hussein's Babylon supergun that was supposedly developed in Iraq in the late 80s and the early 90s, and this would have given Iraq the ability, under the Hussein regime, to project rounds from a supergun into low Earth orbit. I mean, why bother with ballistic missiles when you can build yourself a super gun, right? We supposedly have ballistic missiles and Scud intermediate range missiles that you could launch, but build a super gun. It's just really cool. And now we come to the main focus for this exploration. This enormous 8th century temple in India was carved from one rock. Formed from a single block of excavated stone, Kailasa Temple is considered one of the most impressive cave temples in India. The enormous structure is one of 34 cave temples and monasteries that are collectively known as the Ellora Caves. Located in the western region of Maharashtra, the caves are a UNESCO World Heritage Site and include monuments dating between 600 and 1000 CE. What other dates would it be? While there are many impressive structures on site, it's the megalithic Kailasa Temple that's perhaps the most well-known. Renowned both for its size and impressive ornamentation, it's not entirely clear who had Kailasa Temple built. So they're admitting to us that they don't know who built this incredible wonder. And you see that oftentimes in the mainstream. And of course, to their credit, they do recount the legend behind it. Renowned both for its size and impressive ornamentation, while scholars have yet to discover its true origins, a medieval legend paints a romantic picture behind the Mammoth Temple. And I'd argue you probably get a better account as to how it was built in this medieval legend. Why is it always the word medieval, too? According to a story written in Katha Kalpatru by Krishna Yanavakli, and I know I'm butchering the pronunciations, feel free to correct me in the comments. When a king was severely ill, his queen prayed to the god Shiva that her husband would be cured. In return for his health, the queen vowed to construct a temple in Shiva's name and fast until the shikara, or peak of the temple, was completed. The king quickly got better and construction began on the temple, but to the couple's horror, they realized it would take years for the shikara to emerge. Luckily, a clever engineer came along and explained that by starting from the top of the mountain, he could make the temple's shikara appear within a week. This was much to the relief of the queen, who could quickly finish her fast, and thus the temple was constructed from the top down. Though this is a legend and not fact, waving the finger, the truth is that Kailasa was built from the top. So they're saying the legend was actually correct. This unusual decision called for 200,000 tons of volcanic rock to be excavated from the rock. Yes, because volcanic rock is much more malleable and easily to chip off than rock itself, right? Standing at about 3 stories tall, a horseshoe-shaped courtyard has a Gopuram tower at its entrance. Given the vast space and the ornate decorations of the temple, it's believed that the work may have started with Krishna I, but could have carried on for centuries, with different rulers adding their own flair. So they have something they can't explain, and they give us the typical explanation that they do for many of the monasteries that we see that are isolated all over Europe and in odd pieces of terrain. It was built thousands of years ago, or 1,000 years ago, and then over time we've added to it and continuously modified it. Makes sense, and it's a great catch-all. The very fact that this extraordinary structure is even there, and it does appear as though it's carved out of the mountain or the face of rock, it just defies easy explanation. We wonder how such a structure was achieved in its construction. I find it hard to believe there would be thousands of workers with hammers and chisels or the technological implements available at the time of the 6th to the 10th century, or whenever it was actually constructed, who would be toiling for hours every day, chiseling all of this to perfection. And yet, when we look at the structure, that's exactly what we see. Everything appears to have been carved to perfection. But how did they do it? Our modern implementations would make us think that some form of laser could have been used. But what if they had some greater form of technology? Some other ability to manipulate and shape and create something like this out of existing rock. We think of modern 3D printing capabilities, but that seems very rudimentary compared to what we see here. Again, this looks like another extraordinary achievement that we could not replicate today, even with all of our greatest technologies employed on it. You see the fine detail when you look at the structure from many different angles. And this is just opening the book on our explorations in India. India, overall, is an extraordinary place. And there are many examples of the old world in India that are stunning and breathtaking and defy any sort of explanation. We look at all the detail in temples that are carved out of rock, and yet that's the only explanation they can give us, is that they were carved. But what if they had some other means to form and create these incredible structures? And here's an example of some interiors. And again, we'll be told the same thing, that this structure to the left in the roof, or the ceiling, was carved. What kind of effort would that have taken if it was really carved? And even this on the right, the ornate detail and the time it would have taken. How did they do it? We will be exploring both of these structures that we see in this picture in future explorations, and I invite you to join me. Ah, yes, Civil War reenactments. One of the great traditions of being an American is either participating in a Civil War reenactment or observing one. You see how broadly realistic this one appears to be. We have our Union soldiers and we have our mounted Confederate soldiers. And then we see the other prime factor of evidence for the Civil War in the United States, the many military cemeteries. And to be quite frank, these seem to be the most prominent forms of evidence that we have in the United States that a civil war occurred. However, we're looking much more broadly than that. We're looking at the Reset War of 1847, or more specifically, a broad range of conflicts that occurred across the world from 1847 to 1870. Of course, if you're a frequent watcher of this channel, you know how we feel about years and what the actual dating system says the real year is. But regardless, we're looking to answer the question on what was the primary source of the orphans for the Orphan Trains. I was asked that question many times after doing the Orphan Trains video, and I thought that it's also time to cover the aspect of conflict in the three phases of changing a society, which include conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. We look at our 5 eras theory timeline, and we're looking at the contemporary age. We're looking at how we transitioned from the previous age, which we call the Tartarian age on this channel, but it could have many different names, to our contemporary age. We have 3 different theories on when the last reset occurred. And again, this is all dependent on a dating system, which may or may not be accurate, or may be completely fraudulent. We just don't know. But we suspect that the reset occurred either in 1850, 1800, or 1750. In today's exploration, we're going to see an abundance of evidence that indicate that it may have occurred in or around 1850. Again, going off of the dating system that we were given and the points of reference that we were given. Now, we're making some broad-based assumptions that these are correct, the dating systems are correct, and the reference systems are correct. There's another video on this channel that you can watch where we talk about the unreliability of the dating system and how we're really dependent upon the good word of many governments and many institutions, of course the ones that preceded our current governments, because we're questioning the trust of governments, and we know that we don't need to question the trust of our current governments. They have many checks and balances in place. But previous governments that our current governments tell us are not reliable. The Reset War, 1847 to 1870. Now, all of these conflicts that we're going to be looking at were conflicts that occurred in the mainstream account. These are all historical conflicts. And we're going to look at each of these conflicts and how they're related. And surprisingly enough, many of these conflicts are related back to the United States Civil War, which is very strange. What does this really tell us about the state of affairs in the land in 1847 to 1870? We start with the United States Civil War, which seems to be the primary event that was the catalyst for many other events. We're told that this was a great struggle against slavery, and that this occurred 1861 to 1865, the North against the South. While that was occurring, we also had ongoing Native American wars, where the United States government attempted to subdue all the Native American tribes, and this was an ongoing conflict. There were conflicts that occurred during the Civil War, after the Civil War, before the Civil War. There was the Mexican War in 1846 to 1848, where a U.S. Expeditionary Force went to Mexico and defeated it. There was the Walker War, where U.S. filibuster went down to Nicaragua and took it over, a guy by the name of William Walker, and he was defeated by an army led by Costa Rica, of all nations. Then there were the Irish raids that occurred after the Civil War. Bizarre. Finally, we go to South America. There was conflict in Chile with the Revolution of 1851. There was the Pereira Revolt in Brazil, 1848 to 1849. And then there was constant conflict in Colombia, 1851 to 1885. So we've already looked at two entire continents, North and South America, what we're supposedly told is the New World, and we see that they are rife with conflict during this particular time. What exactly was going on during the 19th century, or the period of time that we're told is the 19th century? We've only looked at two continents, and we've seen that they've already been overrun with conflict. What about Australia and New Zealand? Well, in New Zealand we had the Maori Wars, and in Australia we had the Aboriginal Wars, which were somewhat similar in their ongoing nature to the Native American conflicts in North America. So it's interesting. We have expeditionary conflicts occurring where nations project military power to faraway lands, which is supposedly supposed to be very difficult and require great logistics. And then we also have internal insurrection. Every type of conflict occurring during the time when technology and communications were supposedly far more limited than they were to this day. Well, let's take a look at another continent. What about Africa? Well, in Africa, we had the Scramble for Africa and New Imperialism, which supposedly occurred from 1833 to 1914. The brutal and bloody colonialism, which European nations tried to impose their will by carving up pieces of Africa for their own exploitation. Another form of mercantilism, if you will, where the people were either enslaved or they were exploited. No doubt that many examples of this occurred. All right, well, let's try Europe. Well, in Europe, we had the revolutions of 1848 to 1849, apparently a massive social uprising against the ruling order, which supposedly the monarchy defeated, and then the monarchy imposed many of these reforms, bizarrely enough. The United Kingdom, which I say is separate from Europe, had the Chartist revolt or revolution in 1848, where a group of middle-class people tried to revolt. And then there were other wars occurring across Europe, and then even the First and Second Schleswig Wars, which involved the Nordic nations and Germany, oddly enough. Russia was involved in the Crimean War in 1853 and 1856, which was another large-scale conflict facing the United Kingdom and France, almost a precursor to many other conflicts to come in the future. And then there was the ongoing Caucasian War, where the Russians were supposedly trying to destroy and defeat many different groups of people who had been forgotten to history, and this had been an ongoing war for many decades prior to this period, and yet when we open up to this period, this war is ongoing. So we see all of this conflict, and to be fair, there is far more detail that I'm covering here. We're just looking at these conflicts in totality. Well, let's go to Asia proper. We have the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, 1847 to 1848. China, we have vast conflict. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which supposedly killed 20 to 30 million people. The Second Opium War, where we had numerous nations, once again, United Kingdom, France, I'm using modern names that say simple, supported by the United States, 1856 to 1860. In Japan, we had the Japanese Civil War, 1850 to 1864, and then a few short years after that, the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate was overwhelmed and they had to return to the emperor's authority. These are all historically documented conflicts, and you can see that every single continent in the world between the years of 1847 and 1870 were rife with conflict. And not just regional conflicts. These were external conflicts, these were expeditionary conflicts. Was this really what we're told, or was this the Reset War from 1847 to 1870? The agenda with which to destroy the remnant enclaves of the previous civilization that did not go with the reset. Now there's a lot of evidence that we can consider that shows that this is indeed what occurred. We have all these conflicts that occurred in a short period of time. Consider the analogy of all the city fires that we have, and we look at how if you change one of the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, you can suddenly change the how. Now imagine if the W, the when, on these conflicts was changed. Imagine if all these conflicts occurred within a much shorter period, say 5 to 10 years. Would we consider this a world war? Consider how many of the leaders in Europe who were connected with the revolution of 1848 to 1849 actually ended up becoming significant Union Army officers in the United States during the United States Civil War. 8 out of 10 pictured here became very prominent Union Army officers. No, none served with the Confederacy, they all served with the Union. And you can see them in the Union Army uniforms. It's an intriguing premise, and what's this really saying? They failed in the revolution, supposedly in Europe, although the monarchies that defeated them, including some of the most fanatical monarchs, ended up imposing many of these reforms, and we're told they just had no choice to do it. It's a fascinating dichotomy. We also look at the casualties from 1800 to 1899, and of course we see in the early 19th century the Napoleonic Wars supposedly produced the most casualties, but are they even counting any of the casualties that occurred in China? 20 to 30 million would take you well off this chart, or are they just saying that they're spread out? Ascertaining the number of casualties is always very difficult. Whenever you look up a single conflict, say the United States Civil War, depending on the day and the source, you'll get a vast disparity in the number of casualties reported. And of course, they'll try telling you, well, we're reevaluating the number of killed, wounded, died of wounds, sick, injured, etc. And it's a very interesting consideration because they're supposed to be historians. Let's look at some pictures of these conflicts, and we'll start with the Crimean War. And we look at this picture and we see what appears to be some sort of expeditionary force, although these are some of the earliest pictures that were supposedly taken, and we have to consider the detail that we see with the land and these ships. What's exactly going on here? Does this really look like an organized military expedition? Now, of course, the historical account will tell us, well, the United Kingdom hadn't participated in a war for some time, and they were simply out of practice. It had been since the Napoleonic Wars and Wellington's great victory at Waterloo that the United Kingdom's great military machine had gotten to exercise itself. Look at this intriguing building. Sort of a pyramid building that looks like it is supposed to serve as both a church. I wonder, did they just affix a cross on top of it, or was it always there? Supposedly this is from the Crimea. Although one wonders on the authenticity first and foremost of these pictures. I guess you can actually see clouds on it, which is always a unique aspect of these older pictures. And what's the actual date on it? And the location, because the reality is anybody can associate anything with any image that they want to, and that's something that we always keep in mind on this channel. And it's important to always ask questions and not be solidified into a particular belief, because if we look at how all systems operate, here's another picture of what appears to be port operations, and here perhaps we can see maybe a little bit more of an example of an initial military expedition in the Crimean War. And we see some armed sailing ships in the background, which look like they have cannons in them. They're cramped awfully close together, but perhaps that was the realities of the port. We can understand that. It looks like we see some sort of very rudimentary rail checks right in front there, where they're offloading what appears to be the supplies in the crates. There's many different movies that try to give an interpretation as to what happened during the Crimean War, and they're quite fascinating in how they seem to depict a historical narrative. One of the most legendary aspects of the Crimean War is the Charge of the Light Brigade. And here, looking at these uniformed British soldiers, we see a vast array of uniforms, and yet does this really look practicable? It's the same questions that we have when we look at the United States Civil War. Yet, oddly enough, there's also something similar about this disparity of uniforms. Is this really one nation's military? Or is this some other military that was actually engaged in an expeditionary operation? Many of these photos give clues that there could be something else entirely going on. And yet, for many people to even ask these questions, they find it very offensive and absurd. Now, if these conflicts did occur as we're told, I don't mean to question the bravery or the valor of these veterans. But we have to ask questions about this because then we see images like this. Look at how well built up that building is, or that post is in the background. And we have, of course, cannons, and then the very well stacked cannonballs. Look like they're in position to conduct some sort of siege or to bombard the fort. It doesn't look like the cannons are actually in position to defend the fort, but who really knows? We always get so many conflicting accounts with many of these so-called pictures that we have, and here we have more of the classic vanilla sky where you can't see a cloud, and you certainly can't see what's on the distant horizon. I wonder why. Yes, people say I wonder a lot, but if you're not wondering a lot, then you're just taking all these pictures at face value, and you're never really going to get anywhere. This is an interesting one because we see what's supposedly a defensive position, a very well built-up redoubt. We're told that the United States Civil War is really the first modern war where they experienced trench warfare towards the end of it, and yet this looks a lot like trench warfare to me, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't count it as trench warfare because there weren't an extensive series of trenches. Ask a military historian and they'll tell you 10 different things depending on when you ask them and what conflict you're asking them. And no, I don't say that as a derogatory remark towards military historians. I'm merely saying that to consider the fact that there are many different perspectives, even in the mainstream, about what actually happened in these conflicts. Look at how many times the account of World War II has changed in terms of what actually happened, and that was a conflict that only occurred about 80 years ago. Here we see more soldiers, and they look like they're uniformed a little bit more uniformly, if you'll excuse the pun. Yet again, we always get the same feeling that we do when we look at American soldiers in the US Civil War. And again, these are British soldiers, or so we're told. Who really knows? It seems like they're just having a grand old time, and, war is just really a great old vacation. Although if you watch many of those movies about the Crimean War from whatever time frame in the previous decades, it gives you the impression it really wasn't a very fun conflict. And then you also have accounts that medical services were very poor. And you look at a picture like this, and again, you get this impression of the attempt of logistics. Why do all these cannonballs look so old, as though they've been sitting there for decades? Well, it was just very dry and arid, and the wind blew some dust on them, and they just left them there. I wonder who actually piled all those cannonballs there. It just looks like a pile of junk, as though something has hit the land and people are simply responding to it. You also see what looks to be a steam stack in one of the ships in the background. Now, yes, we're told they had that technology at the time and the Industrial Revolution had occurred, of course. Yet there's just so many anomalies in this picture, to include even the structure in the background. And this is supposedly a picture of combat from the Crimean War. Although this is a bit of a rendering, it appears to be mixed with a little bit of a real-life photograph. It's hard to tell. And that's another ambiguity with these photos. And we always talk about or lament the fact that we don't have actual combat photos from the United States Civil War or the Crimean War. Yet, again, this gives me the nature that this is potentially trench warfare, if this is indeed how it happened, although who knows if this is how it happened. If you're in a military expedition and you're attempting to conquer a land, are you really just going to dig in and sit around and do trench warfare? Or are you going to use maneuver warfare? Oh well. Military historians can correct me in the comments. I'm sure they'll enjoy it. Let's go to Japan in the Meiji Restoration. Now, the interesting thing about Japan was that it was under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, and if you've ever read James Clavell, he details it very well, albeit with alternate names, in the book Shogun, about how Japan had fallen under the rule of the shogun, or military dictator, instead of the emperor. Japan is such an interesting place because, to this day, it has a very strong culture and a strong sense of identity, and we see beautiful architecture. And this is typically the kind of architecture that we associate with Japan, these sort of castles, whether it's Osaka Castle or Tokyo or Yedo. This is Commodore Perry, and he led the U.S. military expedition to open Japan to the world. Very fine photograph. He looks like a very squared away and stern U.S. naval officer. I like how he has one button unbuttoned, and it looks like he has another button not quite buttoned all the way. I don't know, maybe he was just a comfortable kind of guy. He looks like he was very easygoing, very jovial. You would think, though, that if he was taking a professional photograph, and given the amount of time that they put into professional photographs, he would make sure that all his buttons were buttoned and he would look professional and stern. But perhaps because he had the name Perry, because Perry is a traditional U.S. military name going back to the War of 1812, another interesting conflict in and of itself, he didn't have to have his uniform fixed up properly for his picture. And here we see this opening of Japan. There was no real contact between the United States and Japan, at least no formal diplomatic relations until this Perry expedition occurred, again in the 1850s. And Perry apparently forced Japan to accept him, and they just let him in there, even though, according to historical accounts, Japan was very distrustful and reluctant to allow foreigners in their land. Can't imagine why they would feel that way. And for some reason, they just decided to respect this ebullient and very brash U.S. naval officer who put on such a great display that apparently it somehow intimidated the Japanese. Very interesting account, and these are some of the earlier pictures that we see of Japan from the 1860s and 1870s, and again we see a very well built out and developed infrastructure, many power lines, tracks, and well built out buildings. Not exactly what we'd expect to see for the 1860s, 1870s in Japan, but again there could be something off on the dating on the photo. It could be from the early 20th century. It's just strange, and again, we have many conflicting accounts from this, and when we consider this account of these conflicts that we're looking at, we wonder, is this an accurate photo, or is this something else that's trying to give us a different impression of what Japan was? Or is this really what Japan looked like in the 1860s and 1870s? Well, if this is really what Japan looked like, we have a very conflicting account. And again, another picture of what we're told is supposed to be part of one of the imperial areas in Japan after the emperor had retaken power from the Tokugawa shogunate. And there's many movies made about that. Perhaps the most recent one is The Last Samurai, which is supposedly from that time frame, although it's quite an interesting movie, especially when you consider some of the scenes from it. But look at that structure there, that archway. there are parts of it that have a very different construction appeal to it, and there's other aspects to it that don't really show what they're really doing. So I'm trying to wonder, what exactly is this showing? Now, this is the steam engine that Commodore Perry apparently brought along with him. Now, imagine loading the steam engine on and off a sailing ship, even a steam-driven one, because Commodore Perry was a big proponent of steam-driven ships. Look at the date on that. 1883? Or is that an I? Come see our amazing steam engine from 1883. It's from the future. Was Commodore Perry a time traveler too? Or is this an old date? What depiction is this miniature steam engine even from? Because that's what we're told that it is. Is this an American depiction? A Japanese depiction? Something else entirely? Is that really an I? Well, if you're interested in the dating system, check out our dating video on the channel. The Taiping Rebellion. Lots of conflict in China during the 19th century. There was an internal conflict between the Qin dynasty and the Taiping Rebellion. Now, details of this conflict seem to be a little difficult to come by, especially if you're not actually in China, but apparently this was a violent internal conflict that involved large armies. Naturally, there's no pictures of it. We only have depictions like this. So if anybody speaks Chinese or is familiar with Sino history from this period of time, I'll admit that I haven't studied it. I have some bare-bones knowledge on what I'm told on the historical account is, so I welcome comments. Yet it seems like it was a very brutal conflict, and some accounts say that 20 up to nearly 30 million Chinese died in this conflict. It sounds far more brutal than the United States Civil War was, which even at the highest end was 1 million Americans that had died. So what was really going on during this time frame? It's very difficult to decipher if these conflicts were what we're told they were, or, again, were these conflicts really an expeditionary force that was going about destroying the enclaves, the remnants of the previous civilization? When you factor in even the historical account that there's only 23 years dispersing these conflicts, and many of them occurred during the same time frame, you're given the impression that it seems like there's a lot of holdout enclaves. There are settlements with walls around them that are under siege. And why would that come up as a recurring theme? And it seems to be a recurring theme in many of these conflicts. I'm simply trying to interpret what data that we have. It's very difficult to get a clear picture. And that's why this kind of research can be very ambiguous and, to be honest, frustrating at times. We just want some clear answers. We would like some solid answers, some solid evidence that tells us what's really going on. Okay, if this was a civil war in China, we understand it's a terrible thing, war. And yet it seems as though the entire land during this time frame was just overwhelmed with war, internal and external conflict. Why is it now it seems as though everyone, at least in the Western world and modern media sources, are perfectly content to have all their attention focused on one regional conflict, which on the surface is only really between two nations? Yet during this time frame, it seems as though we have more conflict than we did in World War I and World War II combined. A lot of alternative researchers will point back to what was called the 7 Years' War, or the French-Indian War, depending where it was, 1756 to 1763, and state that that was World War Zero. And here's one of the few pictures that we have of the revolutions of 1848, and this was the Chartist movement in the United Kingdom. Very interesting. This seems like a photo, although does it really seem like a photo? We've looked at it before on this channel. See a very large compound in the background with some impressive buildings and a large smokestack. You see many individuals wearing top hats, and supposedly this is a meeting of the Chartists, the group of people that wanted more rights, especially for the middle and lower classes, or so we're told, and that supposedly this was an offshoot of the social upheaval that was occurring in Europe at 1848, even though this is in the United Kingdom. Now, the revolutions of 1848 are something you will find virtually no pictures of, and in my research I could not really find any pictures, and these were a series of uprisings that occurred against the aristocratic governments across many nations of Europe, Austria, Denmark. And again, we have the same kind of pictures. It looks like there are settlements that are under siege or being assaulted. What exactly is going on here? We also have a similar feeling or theme that we have in the United States Civil War, and of course many people will be saying, well, it's in the same time frame, they wore the same uniforms, they used the same tactics. What's interesting though is the vast disparity in casualties that you get in many of these conflicts, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But look at this, and look at some of these uniforms. even though this is in Europe, there's a very distinct feeling of, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, I'm just calling what I see. It almost feels like this is something else from the United States Civil War. If you change those flags to red, white, and blue and put stars on them in the field, you have to wonder, is this really depicting this kind of conflict? Is this really what was going on? I mean, yes, these are all just drawn and painted pictures. Anybody could do these pictures. They could be from any time frame. They could say anything. Yet, this is what's being depicted and shown to us. And again, more uprisings and more cities. Again, and again. Whether it's pictures, whether it's drawn pictures or paintings, or some combination using some means that we don't fully understand, we see a plethora of evidence that shows similar uniforms, similar tactics, and similar types of operations, which seems to involve either sieges or assaults on cities or settlements, occurring all across the land. That's the key theme that's very difficult to neglect when you consider all these conflicts. It's strange enough that they all occurred within such a compressed time frame, according to the mainstream historical account from 1850 to 1870, or 1848 to 1870, or whatever years you want to go by. But then not trusting when the years actually occurred and seeing our little miniature steam engine before, it makes us call into question the actual dates and the years and what was really going on during this time frame. If you could insert a year or two into a time frame, or if you could simply report events occurring on different years, how difficult could you make it to track the actual course of true historical events? Now, of course, people will say that this is absurd, that would never happen, there's too many overlapping authorities, and there's too much collaboration. Yet here, when you look at this picture, again, I see uniforms that look very similar to what the Union Army wore in the United States Civil War. But of course, you can see whose flags are back there, and you know this is not depicted in the United States. But something about it has a similar feeling to it. It's also intriguing when you consider the fact that so many foreign nations sent officers that served in the United States Civil War, and they were already wearing similar uniforms in the years beforehand. Perhaps I'm simply reading too much into it, yet why in all these photos do these all look so much the same? And this is about the only picture we'll get of the Caucasian War in Russia, which is merely a painted picture where we see the type of conflict that was going on there. It was a long-running, brutal conflict and supposedly had denigrated to the status of a genocidal war. Although, looking at the overall scope of these conflicts, you have to question if this was a genocidal war across all the lands. Because when we look at how the casualties have vast disparities in them, and I'll give an example. In the United States Civil War, we're told anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Americans died. And then in the conflict that occurred in Canada immediately following that, we're told that only 37 people died when this Irish nationalist force from the United States invaded Canada and had to be defeated by the Canadian militia. Yes, this really happened, 1866 to 1871. I guess President Grant didn't opt to stop this or was too busy with other matters. The Opium War in China is quite intriguing as well, and we do have some photos from that because that's another foreign expedition. So while there was this large uprising against the legitimate Chinese government at the time, 1850 to 1864, there was also this foreign expedition. Now, there had been an earlier Opium War. This was the second one, where the United Kingdom and France, and then with some help from the United States, were involved in China. This is really interesting because you can look at the historical accounts, you can do all your appropriate research, and yet you have to accept the fact that there are overlapping conflicts occurring. There are foreign forces that are involved in a nation, while that nation is trying to suppress insurgents or rebels within its own borders. So every type of conflict, every type of destruction, every type of death that we can imagine, what does this really tell us about what's going on in the 19th century? And I think this is some of the most substantial evidence that we can have. Consider this Opium War where we have the picture here of the well-uniformed, trained-led British Army fighting with the Chinese forces. And then, of course, we see, look at the architecture. Now, again, this is a painted picture, so who knows about the veracity of it, and this could be dramatized. Yet our mainstream account tells us that these events all really happened within close proximity of each other on the dateline. It's another example of the more questions we ask and the more research that we do, if we actually ask questions about it and consider it within the realm of logistical limitations, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And here we actually have a photo showing some destruction and some death from supposedly the Opium War, although who knows? Was it the Opium War in China? Was it part of this overall greater United States Civil War? Or was it really this worldwide expeditionary force that was all operating on the same orders, on the same agenda, to destroy the remnants of the enclave of the previous civilization? Because there's no shortage of cemeteries, and there's no shortage of memories or records from these conflicts. And here's the other aspect of it. A lot of alternative researchers will tell you that you have to completely disregard history if you're going to be successful or effective in this kind of research. My approach, though, has been consider the fact that what if what they're telling us does have a lot of half-truths or even quarter-truths in it? Now, what do I mean by that? Think on the fact that if someone could show you a little bit of evidence that something's true, they can't show you evidence that it's completely true, but they can at least show you one thing that something's true. Here's an example. There's a cemetery. There's names on it. There's ranks on it. There's dates on it. This is a cemetery from the United States Civil War. This is from the Battle of Vicksburg. This is from the Battle of Shiloh. Or in China, this is from the Battle of Beijing or whatever. And then on top of all that, we're told that we have global temperature change that occurred very significantly in the 1840s to the 1850s with the ending of the Little Ice Age. Now, who knows if this is accurate data from the time frame, but again, we're told by our mainstream accounts that this is very accurate and that there was an extreme temperature change at the time with the Little Ice Age finally ending in the mid-19th century. Strangely enough, that overlaps with this period of conflict that we were just looking at from 1847 to 1870. And we have pictures like this, which show what was still going on in places across Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, where areas were very cold and they were iced over for a grand period of time. Now, granted, you could still go there during winter potentially and see this happening, and I've had some viewers tell me, well, there's just extreme weather factors that can hit places at certain times, and yes, this is all true. But at the same time, this is what our official account tells us happened, that this little ice age finally came to an end, and this time frame just happened to overlap with this period of intense conflict, really a world war if you want to think about it, and something far more brutal than a world war. Oh, and let's also bring up the 1859 Carrington event. The 1859 Carrington event, supposedly there were fluctuations from the sun that caused massive disruptions in telegraph communications. Yet, oddly enough, when you try to verify this event in local media sources, looking at newspapers from the time, whether it's from the United States or Europe, it becomes very difficult to verify that this event truly occurred. Now, if someone out there has some sort of access or some sort of ability to look at different sources and give indications from the time frame that the Carrington event truly occurred, then by all means, share in the comments. It's just strange, though, to consider that. And now let's go back and look at some of these pictures from the time frame of these intense conflicts. So we've had vast climate change supposedly occurring. We've had the Carrington event that hasn't occurred yet at the time of this photo. And we have all this conflict. And yet, here's what a cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland looked like in 1856. Very beautiful, very well built out. I like the brick there, the nice beautiful red brick. And look at that light right there. Of course, we'll just be told that it's a gas light and they had to light it every night. Whether it's a gas light or not is irrelevant. Look at the construction that we have within these buildings and the layout of this street and this sidewalk. Some of it looks like it's very beautiful and brand new, and other parts look very old. Then we go to Paris, and we see how things looked there in 1857. And we see very well built out buildings, and we see an amazing variety in architecture. But we have to remember there's all these conflicts that were going on. There was this massive social uprising that occurred in 1848 across all of Europe. And there was supposedly climate change and everything else going on. And yet, I mean, granted, this is another one of those questionable photos because you don't see the detail in the sky so well. Yet we know and believe that there are buildings like this, there was infrastructure like this. And then the Great Eastern at London's Millwall Iron Works in the River Thames in 1857. Again, while the United Kingdom was busy with all of its overseas expeditions and everything else that it was doing. Tell me, does this really look like this ship is under construction, or does it look like this ship is being salvaged? Strangely enough, at how old that large chain over there looks. And I love how we always have the individuals with top hats that are always just sort of hanging around, supervising, or, I don't know, maybe just getting in the picture. Almost looks like there's some sort of survey going on here, and they're all just posing. As though these are explorers who had just arrived in this land and they want to see what they have. And then let's not forget the other great achievements of France. Supposedly they built this incredible viaduct in 1861 to 1863. After the Carrington event, after all these social upheavals and all this conflict, they managed to do all this. It's when you start to take these overlapping factors into account that we're told from the official historical narrative. That alone, regardless of whatever you think about the actual years or dates, that's where you have to start asking some very hard questions. Because the more you look at this, the more detail that you look at it within, you start to have more questions. Again, looking back at Paris, and we see what a beautiful modern city it looks like in 1857. Fairy tale towers everywhere you look. Well, it's Cathedral of Notre Dame, so it was always well built out, and it was amazing what they can do. Yes, of course. And people will tell you it was all because of the Industrial Revolution, and we could achieve great things in the Industrial Revolution. Well, tell me, was the Cathedral of Notre Dame built before or after the Industrial Revolution? I'll just leave it at that. I like the road there where it looks like there's a lot of mud or dirt on it, but man, maybe that was just horse and carts riding across. Look how beautiful and modern those bridges look, though, across the river. Very intriguing and very well in depth. So going back to the 5 eras theory, I think we have a lot of evidence that the reset occurred in or around 1850, maybe 5-10 years before or 5 to 10 years after. Who knows for sure? And I'm basing this on the amount of conflict that we have from 1847 to 1870. I'm basing this on the fact that they tell us there was a major climate shift that may have occurred for a variety of reasons in the years leading up to this. And I'm also basing this on the Carrington event. These events all seem to correspond. Now, could it be possible these are all just false flags or misleading information that we're given? Absolutely. There's a reason why I don't tie myself too hard to these beliefs. We are doing alternative research, which is based on theory and conjecture. We have to ask questions and we have to keep exploring. That is how we're going to find the true answers to many of these mysteries. And these are going to continue to be mysteries no matter what we do. Now consider, I've gone back and I've actually looked at my major theories for what's the reason for the existence of Tartaria in the old world. And oftentimes I go to theory 1, we've experienced 5 ages or eras of time. But the more I look into things like this, sometimes I wonder if it's theory 3. Are we living in a simulation? Why do we have so many inconsistencies with our timelines and so many reality glitches? And depending on who you talk to, different people have experienced different realities. And they really believe that they have experienced different realities. It's not something that people are making up. Now, of course, you can just sit there and pretend that everything is just fine, and it's just because people have fallacies in their memory. But, of course, these are the same people that will be told that other fallacies or things that conflict are true because certain authority figures tell them that that's the way things should be. And they will not question it. And, of course, you can see these real-life examples every day. I don't have to tell you examples of people simply adhering to authority. Just go out and walk around and you'll see it. Or is it possible we're living in a dream, our own or another? You know, I always keep these theories on the table because when you look at all this conflicting information and you see just this one historical account of a time frame from 1847 to 1870, 23 years, it's a lot of questions that come up. And I think this is one of the things that shows why we have all these questions. Now, going back to the original point of this exploration, the origin of the orphans, I have some theories to explain where these orphans came from. Now, I believe there were 2 different phases of the Orphan Trains. There was the initial phase in 1850 to 1870 and a subsequent phase that occurred all the way as far as the 1930s and the 1940s. And here are the major theories. 1, the Reset War destroyed remaining enclaves of last civilization. So what remained of Tartaria that didn't go along with the reset, it had to be destroyed. Prisoners were taken en masse from these conflicts going on across the lands. And many of them were taken to either asylums or prisoner of war camps, where many died. Orphans from across the land were shipped to New York City, And there they were distributed across the United States because for whatever reason, the plan that they had indicated the United States was going to be settled from people from across the world. Now, going back to the orphan trains, people say that in the pictures they only see one particular type of appearance of human being, and that's very true. However, just because there's a lack of pictures of other types of human beings doesn't mean that they weren't part of the orphan trains as well. For example, just because the media doesn't talk about a certain conflict going on in a certain part of the world doesn't mean there's not a conflict going on, right? In any event, it's hard to say exactly what the reality of the situation was. But I suspect that the reason that they do this is just to keep people questioning and just to sow division, as because what you display in pictures can always be questioned, and it can always cause people to question their status in life and stay more concerned about questioning their trust in each other as opposed to questioning trust in, we'll just say, institutions perhaps they're not supposed to. Finally, what's the repopulation aspect of this? Consider if we had a reset and a worldwide conflict, we know that many human beings died. We're under the impression, and this is reinforced by the fact, that labor was required, especially in certain areas of the world, and they used child labor quite extensively. The orphan trains initially were designed to provide child labor, and it seems they were provided to induce diaspora and dysphoria amongst the people. There's also the fact that there was a vast population influx in the United States through San Francisco, as we talk about how the Transcontinental Railroad was supposedly constructed by two different ethnic groups of people working from the east and the west and meeting in the middle. Well, what's the truth and the reality to it? We just don't know. We have all these hints and all these clues, and this is why we have to keep doing this exploration. I hope today's exploration provided a theory, though, for where these orphans may have come from. And could they have grown additional people in test tubes using alchemical processes that would have provided more of a population, or the incubator babies? Absolutely. And I believe that was a subsequent phase to the plan, when they required more people and more labor in certain areas that were depopulated from all this conflict and everything else that was going on as part of the reset. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into Orphan Trains, completing the reset. The objective of today's exploration is to consider the role the Orphan Trains played in the last reset. New viewers of the channel may not be familiar with the 5 eras theory. The channel has several theories for the existence of the Old World and Tartaria, and this is one of the theories that we consider the most plausible, the 5 eras theory. Breaking down the entirety of human existence into 5 distinct eras that were separated by hard resets. The Golden Age comprising the first 3 eras, and then the Tartarian Age, or the age that preceded ours, whatever you want to call it, the civilization that we believe was across all the lands that came before us. Then we had a hard reset, and the year on that hard reset we debate. Was it 1850, 1800, and 1750? And that brought us into our contemporary age, or the current time frame that we have many unique and creative names for, such as the age of plastic, the age of disposability, and the age of many different alluring historical narratives. What we're looking at here, though, is the time frame immediately following 1850, which is when we believe the last reset occurred. And we're going to look specifically at how that reset was implemented. It looks like there were 3 distinct approaches that were used: conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, and typically in that chronological order. And in fact, even to this day, we see conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. The 19th century was rife with conflict, to include the United States Civil War, the Crimean War, and yet you can look and see many other conflicts. After conflict, which seemed to be targeting the remnants of the enclave population, the survivors of the previous civilization, we had assimilation, and that was where everyone found their proper roles in this new civilization after the reset. And then finally you had indoctrination. And indoctrination was ensuring that people had the proper thoughts and that they would never question what had happened. We have many pictures from this time frame that tend to pose more questions than they answer, as though there was some sort of strange massive expedition that was going on across all the lands to pacify what remained of a population. Now, we're told that these are legitimate conflicts, and the historical narrative tells us there was a civil war going on in the United States, there was the Crimean War going on, and so many other conflicts that you can look up yourself that completely dot the landscape of the 19th century, or the timescape as it were as well. It's an intriguing consideration, and yet we see other signs of it that show that there may be much more going on than we're aware in the historical narrative. The United States Civil War is often examined because of the conflicting accounts that we have in what occurred in the Civil War. Oftentimes we have pictures that don't match the narrative that we're given, or create more questions than they answer. For example, we're told time and time again that the United States military, or the Union, was segregated during the Civil War, and yet you see many different pictures that paint a different narrative. Now, were these pictures that were taken for purposes of displaying the political message at that time? And could they have been supporting the war effort as we were told in the historical narrative? Of course. However, there's just too many of them to simply ignore, and we have to wonder if there was something much greater going on, and that the nature of the conflict, and there's no doubt there was a very significant conflict that occurred, and not just in the United States and in the United States Civil War, but in all these conflicts across all the lands. We have to wonder what the true objective of the conflict is. And one of the channel's primary theories is that this conflict was targeting the remnants of the enclave population that had survived the last reset. People that they knew that were not going to go along with the reset and not drop what the truth was in favor of a new historical narrative. We have strange pictures like this that are supposedly from the United States Civil War, where we see large rabbles of people. We'll be told that this is some sort of formation for a militia. But when you look at this image, does this really give you the inclination that this is a militia? Or is there something else going on here? And we have the strange individual there with the top hat. This doesn't appear to be a military formation. It's very odd. You could have any kind of explanation for this photo. Is this a group of refugees going somewhere? Is this a group of people that are being moved from point A to point B against their will? None of the faces look particularly happy. This doesn't look like a group of people that are a militia, or they're going off to defend their homeland against some existential threat. We also think about the role that asylums played in the assimilation and indoctrination aspect of the conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. Earlier, the channel theorized the goals of the Kirkbride Plan, which was the plan behind asylums in the United States, but there were asylums across all the lands to ensure the population adhered to the reset. This was their way to ensure that people properly assimilated and they were indoctrinated. And if they were not, they were sent to the asylum, where they would live out their lives. It also supported the dual purpose of being able to explain the presence of isolated large facilities that didn't make sense. We even had special soldier asylums for soldiers who may have served in this conflict of suppressing the enclaves that remained from the previous civilization, and they were unwilling to accept the narrative that they were given after the conflicts were completed. So they had special asylums to send them off as well too. Now again, this is a theory. This could well be that it's just the historical narrative as we're told. But there's far too much evidence and far too many conflicts in the story to simply ignore it. And now we have to look at how the Orphan Trains played a role in this. We're given many accounts that there were just simply roving bands of children, especially in New York City. And we're told that this was because there were many children born out of wedlock. This is an interesting account because at the same time we're also told that culture in the United States was very different. That religion played a large role and morality played a role within the family. We have to wonder when we see these kind of images, did these children really come from out of wedlock? Or were they the survivors, the remaining children of the families whose parents were killed in the conflict? Those families that were the final survivors of the previous civilization who refused to recognize the authority of the new civilization after the reset. It's It's a very intriguing premise. And we have to wonder, was that their story? We consider the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. Diaspora being the concept of spreading a people from their homeland and removing their identity. And dysphoria, taking away their sense of adventure in life. Children without homes. It's a very noble aspiration. It's very altruistic. We're told that these children were simply compiled in New York City and that there were so many of them in roving bands that they didn't have their parents and they were simply orphans. And they needed to be cared for. They needed to have families. So you can look up the grand plan that we had in our official historical narrative that there was simply a religious figure, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace, who became concerned with the plight of these street children and enacted a plan to where they were going to be transferred to states and families where they could be given wondrous families. Interestingly enough, the numbers that we have for how many were victims of this plan, or perhaps we should say those who benefited from the plan, because that's what we'll be told by the historical narrative, we have to wonder, what was the true number? We're told it was 250,000. But how many was it really? Numbers are always something that seems to be up for debate, and even our casualty figures from the United States Civil War seems to be a very fluid number. That varies depending on what. Of course, we discuss the altruistic nature of this endeavor, and it seems like it's something benevolent and would serve a good purpose. Although it should be noted that the transportation of children away from their parents is something that's occurred time and time again. For example, in World War II during the Blitz of London, where we have children that were taken away from their parents and sent away, ostensibly for their safety. In fact, the film The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe begins in this manner, where the children are taken away to escape the bombing. It's a very mainstream image that reminds us of what happened in the past. It also reminds us that this approach continues, this approach of seeming to want to separate families. Is it something that merely occurs because of events beyond our control? Or is it something much more insidious? Part of a planned, controlled narrative in which we attempt to attack every aspect of an individual's identity. And we start with the most basic, with the family. We look at the images and the concept of the orphan train going back to the United States, and we're told that its success depended on the altruistic nature, the generosity of the farmers, and the mercantilists that these children were being taken to. It's an interesting prospect in the fact that these children were supposedly part of roving bands in New York City, or that they were simply overwhelming the system there, and they needed to be moved to a place to where they could be used. The other aspect, we're told, is that there were vast labor shortages across the Midwest and in other states. And we see these images which show this being a very successful program and everyone benefited from it. The families or the businesses looking to put children to work, and the children were given a place to live, potentially a family, and 3 square meals a day, and a roof over their head. But was it really that benevolent? Was that really the intention behind it? We see these images, and we remember how images can tell a different narrative than what the story that we're given is. We have to wonder, is there something much more insidious behind all this? The question I have is, if there was such a labor shortage across these states, and we'll take a look at a map here in a moment, then why did they need children to fill these labor shortages? Even if your only goal was simply to provide labor and provide efficient labor, it would certainly make more sense to have adults. And I'm told by numerous viewers that there were many people who simply had to work or they would die. And that's why there were so many laborers to do construction jobs. Well, what about agriculture? Isn't it also important to provide food to feed people? They seem to overlook that little fact that they claim there were labor shortages in the Midwest. Labor shortages that can only be filled by children. Interestingly enough, and not just in the farm fields, but in the mills and the plants and whatever baseline manufacturing that we had at that time. A lot of these images are considered shocking today. Of course, there's also the more benign aspect of growing up on a farm and you're part of a family and you work on a farm. Is it really terrifying labor, or are you just doing your chores and you're learning responsibility? It's true. However, you look at this from a grander perspective and you realize this goes beyond the simple concepts of child labor. You see that what's really happening is these children did have families. And we also find instances where there were multiple phases of the orphan trains. The initial orphan trains that ran in 1850 through 1870 seemed to be taking care of the kids that no longer had any parents. And after that, we saw repeat occurrences of the orphan trains, where there are many accounts that one of the parents were still alive. Whether it was the mother or the father, it doesn't matter. And the account we're given is that the mother or father, for some reason, was incapacitated, and therefore the children had to be taken and sent to another family. And if you think about this, and if you think about why this effort would continue, this is where the true insidious nature of the orphan trains is revealed. This is how we destroy a people from establishing an identity and their own individuality. And you'll find plenty of accounts, especially on public broadcasting service or public television, where they talk about how benign and altruistic the orphan trains were and how effective they were. They even have people that they interview who were actual members of the orphan trains, or those who rode the orphan trains, as they euphemistically say, and that they ended up with a good family, that they felt that they benefited from the situation. Even more interesting is that most of the people they interview claim that one of their birth parents were still alive, and yet for various reasons they had to leave. They were alcoholic, or they were suffering from some sort of depression, or there was some other reason. A lot of times, though, when you try to look up the accounts, there was no reason given for why the children were taken from their parents. And remember, this was in the later decades. 1850 to 1870, it seems pretty clear there were a lot of children who simply didn't have parents. But then after that, they seem to repeat the concept of the orphan train as a means of taking children from their parents. It's a theme that appears and reappears in our historical narrative, and it's a disturbing theme because it does contribute to the concepts of diaspora and dysphoria. It prevents people from forming the ability to establish their own identity, and it makes them even more reliant on indoctrination. And if you think about this, you see how effective this is as a tool of indoctrination. Because until these children were given families, they were also kept together. And we think about many of the great schools that children were taken to. We also think about some of the schools that we looked at in our earlier explorations, such as St. Coletta. And we have to wonder if they had a different purpose. Everything, we're told, started in New York, and specifically New York City. This is where all these orphans seemed to be in a vast number. Why just New York City? Or was it because New York City was simply the collection point for all of them? If you think about it, it's a major port, and towards the end of the Civil War and the other conflicts, it would make sense to have the children as orphans go there. And then they were transported to these states, namely the Midwest states, to supposedly work on the farm where there was a shortage of labor. But none of the people who were looking for jobs decided to go out to the Midwest. They just wanted to work as construction workers. I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also being serious at the same time, because this doesn't make any sense. It also doesn't make any sense from the aspect as to why the Midwest would seem underpopulated. We're told it's because it was settled, but then at the same time we see all these towns and all these cities that seem to come up from nowhere. Each of the states of the Midwest also has their own account of the orphan trains, and of course it's always supporting the narrative that this was a benevolent effort, that this was very altruistic, and this helped the children. And yes, I keep using that word altruistic because if we think about the grander aim of this, and the fact that we're told to think a certain way about this, we have to wonder, what's the true objective? And why was this something that was turned to again and again? Especially when we have numerous accounts of families who still had a parent that seemed to be perfectly capable of taking care of their children. This is also reflected more recently in the mainstream. There was a movie from 1979 called The Orphan Train, which you can still watch today, featured Glenn Close, and it was also featured on the very popular 1990s TV show, I'm not knocking it, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, a show that was carried entirely by the charisma of Jane Seymour. And the episode, in fact, was called The Orphan Train, where a group of orphans showed up in Colorado. No, not one of the states, but everything seemed to happen in Colorado if you ever saw that show. And Dr. Quinn decides to team up with the local reverend, and they're going to raise the children, and there goes the plot. Of course, it's resolved within 60 minutes, like many other TV shows. The real point behind this is the fact that you have this concept of the orphan train remaining within the memory of the United States. And yet it's pushed again that this was a very benevolent effort, that we were legitimately trying to help these children. And yet you see other accounts that conflict with that. And I'll start with the story of my great-grandparents. These are the photos from my family, my great-grandparents. The family that originally lived in Cincinnati from 1890 to 1910. Looking at old photos is always very intriguing because they tell a different story. The actual account that I have from my great-grandparents, though, is very difficult to ascertain. And you look at these old photos and sometimes it just makes you feel like you're in a completely different world, as though you're looking at people with familiar faces, and yet the world they're living in just seems very different. This wasn't that long ago. Over 120 years, 130 years at most in some of the photos. And I just wanted to show you what these original photos looked like. This is the photo of my great-grandparents at their wedding ceremony. And they were very happy, according to what accounts that we have, although it's very difficult. And I'll explain why in a moment, why it's difficult to ascertain what truly happened. There was only a few surviving family members that actually made it to the generation, or 2 generations before mine, my grandparents. And there was quite a tragedy that occurred. From what I understand, when they were married, they were very happy, and they were prepared to take their place in life, and they lived in Cincinnati initially. And also the stories that my great-grandfather, pictured on the left here, was a very adventurous individual, and he was someone who had a very keen intellect, and wanted to find answers in his life. Apparently he was someone who didn't necessarily accept the answers that he was given by others, and searched on his own. There's accounts of them going to several different World's Fairs or World's Expositions, to include the Chicago World's Fair, the Cincinnati World's Fair, and finally the St. Louis World's Fair in the early 20th century. However, the records are very difficult, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. They settled on a farm in Kentucky near Cincinnati, and that seemed to be where they lived and enjoyed their initial life. Initially, they had 3 children, and then it increased to 5 children as they were running the typical farm. Here's where the story starts to take an ominous turn. For reasons unknown, my great-grandmother suddenly died, and it's difficult to ascertain exactly why she died. There's nothing stating sickness. There's rumors of post-childbirth difficulties and the usual health aspects of that time. But nobody seems to know for sure, and there's no written account or anything in the news that survived to this day that tells me exactly what happened. The story gets even stranger when the fact that my great-grandfather, an adventurous individual and someone who was reputed to be very reliable, and most of the members of my family, if not all, and all the descendants from this branch of the family, they were all about family and all about going the extra distance to take care of family. Yet for some reason, my great-grandfather had all of his children taken away from him. There was nothing ever stated on an official reason for why this happened, why he would be unable to care for them, or why he'd be unable to move on. Subsequently, he was confined to the Central State Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, where he spent the last 3 decades of his life. These were the last pictures that were taken of him, and this is from the 1940s. I can't get an exact date on the photo. And it was supposedly from the time that my grandmother was able to visit him and took these photos, and you actually see Central State Hospital right behind him here. I do look at his face and I see that he seems to be content or at ease. And there was once a letter that he had written to his children, and yet I can't find that letter. I only have memories of it from my grandmother and her surviving sisters, and most of them have passed away now. Still, I wonder, why were his children taken away? What really happened? I only have more questions than answers. And that was the unfortunate tragedy of how his life ended, and how my grandmother and her sisters were put on a later version of the Orphan Train. The other thing that I found going through the photos was this strange postcard of the concourse at the Union Terminal in Cincinnati. You might recall it's the building we looked at in the exploration of Cincinnati that clearly inspired the Justice League building from the old Super Friends in the 1970s. Curious that this would be found in the effects that remained from my great-grandfather. This structure was not completed until the 1930s, and he was detained, and I'm going to use that word, in Central State Hospital in Louisville long before that. So why was there a postcard like this within his effects? It may not mean anything, but I have to wonder, is there some sort of clue about this? There's nothing that remains of his writings or his journals or even the letter that he wrote to his children after he was sent to Central State Hospital. So all I have to go on are clues, and I'm going to continue these explorations to try to find my own answers, because I feel there are many questions. We're also going to be looking more at the orphan trains, specific examples, and what effects they may have had from 1850 to 1870, and then their continuation in the 20th century. There's much more to explore with this, and yet it's clear we can see that this approach is still used even to this day with conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. It seems to be the way that people are kept in line, and that people are not only given activities which they must focus on, but also how people are controlled through conflict, through their role in society, and then ensuring that they adhere properly to their role in society. These are aspects we're going to continue to explore as we go forward. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the mystery of incubator babies. We have many different rumors mixed with supposed facts about what happened in history, about the development of the incubator, and then the display of many babies in incubators at World's Fairs and on Coney Island. Today's exploration, we're going to be examining these accounts and trying to determine exactly what happened, along with potential theories on what's behind the mystery of the incubator children. Let's go back to the beginning and look at the problem of premature and congenitally ill infants, which we're told is not a new one. Now, I've gotten away from looking at Wikipedia articles on the channel, but in this case I'm going to make an exception because they have a pretty decent summary here. As early as the 17th and 18th centuries, there were scholarly papers published that attempted to share knowledge of interventions. It was not until 1922, however, that hospitals started grouping the newborn infants into one area, now called the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU. Naturally, there's an acronym. Before the Industrial Revolution, premature and ill infants were born and cared for at home and either lived or died without medical intervention. In the mid-19th century, of course, when else would it be, the infant incubator was first developed based on the incubators used for chicken eggs. Dr. Stéphane Tarnier is generally considered to be the father of the incubator, or isolette as it is now known. First I've heard that term. Having developed it to attempt to keep premature infants in a Paris maternity ward warm. Other methods had been used before, but this was the first closed model in addition. He helped convince other physicians that the treatment helped premature infants. France became a forerunner in assisting premature infants, in part due to its concerns about a falling birth rate. Interesting how we continuously hear about these concerns, and especially during that time frame. After Tarnier retired, Dr. Pierre Boudin followed in his footsteps, noting the limitations of infants in incubators and the importance of breast milk and the mother's attachment to the child. Well, I'm glad they noticed something that was so obvious. Budin is known as the father of modern parentology. Oh, excuse me, perinatology. There's all these great medical terms. I got to give them credit, though. They're a lot more creative than the architectural terms that we have. And what is perinatology? It is maternal fetal medicine. See, that's more of a descriptive term. And his seminal work, The Nursling, I'm not going to try it in French, became the first major publication to deal with the care of the neonate. Another factor that contributed to the development of modern neonatology was Dr. Martin Cooney and his permanent installment of premature babies in incubators at Coney Island. A more controversial figure, because what else would he be? He studied under Dr. Budin and brought attention to premature babies and their plight through his display of infants as sideshow attractions at Coney Island and the World's Fair in New York and Chicago in 1933 and 1939, respectively. Infants had also previously been displayed in incubators at the 1897, 1898, 1901, and 1904 World's Fairs. So as you can see, we have something very suspicious going on here that warrants a deeper exploration. So now let's go to the Smithsonian Magazine, another one of our favorite, trusted, reputable sources of information, to look at the account of Martin Cooney. The man who ran a carnival attraction that saved thousands of premature babies wasn't a doctor at all. Martin Cooney carried a secret with him, but the results are unimpeachable. Oh, yes, it sounds so dramatic. Oh, and there's a picture of him right there, holding a child, premature baby who was on view at Coney Island attraction. An exhibition, no less. Nurses in starched white uniforms and doctors in medical coats tended to babies in glass and steel incubators. The infants had been born many weeks premature and well below a healthy birth rate. Stores didn't make clothes small enough to fit their tiny skeletal frames, so the nurses dressed them in dolls' clothes and knitted bonnets. A sign above the entrance read, "Living Babies in Incubators," in letters so large they could be read from the other end of the Chicago World's Fairgrounds, which took place over 18 months in 1933 and 1934. Always in Chicago, it seems. The infant incubator exhibit was built at a cost of $75,000, worth $1.4 million today, and was painted in patriotic red, white, and blue. And let's not forget what was going on in 1933 and 1934, the Great Depression, an event so terrible that Americans couldn't find work and people across the lands were suffering due to the economic depression, the Great Depression, of which has never been seen before or since. The men in charge were leading Chicago pediatrician Dr. Julius Hess and Martin Cooney, who was known across America as the Incubator Doctor. Cooney was a lugubrious man, and that's a word you don't see often, an adjective that's not typically used. Basically, it means he's sad or he appears sad. In his 60s, with thinning gray hair, a mustache, and a stoop, something he jokingly attributed to a lifetime of bending over babies. Of course, Cooney and Hess employed a team of 6 nurses and 2 wet nurses. Martin Cooney had run infant incubator exhibits in which premature babies were displayed to the public for more than 3 decades, most famously at Coney Island in New York City. He had long been regarded by desperate parents as a savior, one who offered medical help to babies written off as weaklings by mainstream medicine. Little side note here, it should be noted that eugenics was really coming into the forefront, supposedly, in the early 20th century. And there were many doctors and part of the mainstream medical establishment, if there is such a thing, that stated that a lot of these infants should simply be left to die, because if they were allowed to live, it would weaken the species. No, this did not start in the 1940s with that terrifying regime that we hear so much about. This mentality started well before that. That's where that terrifying regime supposedly got the ideas. But who knows what the truth is? That's what we're told. But for Hess, who was accustomed to carrying out his work in a more conventional hospital setting, this was a career first. The exhibit was a hit with the Chicago public, who paid 25 cents and flocked by the hundreds of thousands to see the babies. Why is that, one wonders? To celebrate the success of their facility, Cooney organized a homecoming celebration on July 25, 1934, for babies who had graduated from the incubators at the Chicago's World's Fair the previous summer. Of the 58 babies Cooney and Hess had cared for in 1933, 41 returned with their mothers for the reunion. The event was broadcast live on local radio and across the fairgrounds. Well, of course it was. On the radio program, Cooney's exhibit was portrayed by the announcer not as a frivolous sideshow spectacle, but as an invaluable medical facility. The Incubator Station for Premature Babies is not primarily a place of exhibiting tiny infants. Instead, it is actually a life-saving station where prematurely born babies are brought from leading hospitals all over the city, just for the care and attention that are afforded. The place is spick and span, with doctors and graduate nurses in constant attendance. Interesting, almost sounds like a commercial for White Castle. Because of the sideshow setting in which he operated, Cooney's career had always been controversial. Well, of course it is. An effective doctor? That's naturally controversial. Many in the medical professional, interesting, viewed the incubator doctor with suspicion, others with outright hostility. Wonder why. The New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children had repeatedly accused Cooney of exploiting the babies and endangering their lives by putting them on show. And is this the same New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children that advocated eugenics? It's a discussion for another time. None of the complaints was sustained. Who wrote this? And by the 1930s, Cooney was finally being taken seriously as a medical pioneer. Cooney's professional collaboration with Hess marked a key stage in his habilitation. But while doing research for my radio documentary, Life Under Glass, which is being broadcast on NPR stations around the country this August, and my book, Miracle at Coney Island, I made an incredible discovery about a man who has a claim to have changed the course of American neonatal medicine. Here it comes. Cooney was never actually qualified as a medical doctor. Throughout his career, Cooney said he had studied medicine in Leipzig and Berlin. However, I could find no evidence of Cooney, or Cohen as he was known then, having studied medicine at a university in either city. Wonder why this is. To become a physician in Germany, one was required to write a thesis. Things haven't changed that much at all, have they? The U.S. National Library of Medicine has copies of the German records. Librarians could not locate a thesis written by Cooney. It's obvious it couldn't have been lost or anything like that. No, that possibility doesn't even cross the mind. Cooney was deliberately evasive about his date and place of birth. I have discovered that he immigrated to the U.S. in 1888 at 19 years old. And what evidence? Never mind. I'll stop asking questions. But someone at that age would not be old enough to have studied at university in Leipzig and Berlin before going on to do graduate work in Paris at the knee of Pierre Boudin. Funny way to say it. The father of European neonatal medicine, as Cooney claimed to have done in numerous press interviews. In the 1910 U.S. Census, Cooney listed his career as surgical instruments, though Cooney claimed to be the inventor of an incubator. I have been unable to find any evidence that he registered an incubator patent in the U.S. More likely, Cooney was a technician, yet by 1930 he was describing himself in the census as a physician. Oh, you imposter. Over time, the success of Cooney's facility began to attract the attention of some of America's leading pediatricians. Right up until the late 1930s, few American hospitals had incubators, so doctors sent premature babies to him. Very interesting accounts. Cooney took in babies from all backgrounds, regardless of race or social class, a remarkably progressive policy, especially when he started out. He did not take a penny from the parents of the babies. In 1903, it cost around $15, equivalent to around $405 today, to care for each baby. Cooney covered all the costs through the entrance fees. Why not? Presumably unaware that Cooney was not a qualified doctor, pediatricians began coming to the fairgrounds to collaborate with Cooney and study the babies in his care. And yet none of these qualified pediatricians were able to figure out that Cooney was not really a doctor. Fascinating. The distinguished Yale professor, pediatrician, and child development psychologist Arnold Gesell visited Cooney multiple times at the 1939 New York World's Fair. Gesell brought a cameraman with him to film the babies in Cooney's facility. Interestingly, when Gesell wrote his book, The Embryology of Behavior, The Beginnings of the Human Mind, he avoided any mention of Cooney or the sideshow setting where he had carried out much of his research. By contrast, when in 1922 Hess wrote the first textbook on premature birth published in the U.S., Premature and Congenitally Diseased Infants, he wrote, "I desire to acknowledge my indebtedness to Dr. Martin Cooney. Of all Cooney's professional associations, his friendship with Morris Fishbein, the controversial president," what else would it be, "of the American Medical Association," no, those are two things you don't see side to side very often, if ever, "is the most intriguing. Fishbein was the head of the AMA for 25 years and led the association's crusade against quack doctors. The two men were so close, Fishbein sent his aspiring medic son, Justin, to discuss his career with Cooney in New York. If he had been found out, Cooney could have faced a large fine and a lengthy prison sentence. Over the course of his nearly 50-year career, Cooney took in around 8,000 babies, of whom he claimed to have saved around 6,500. While there's no way of verifying the numbers, pediatricians today acknowledge that the team of doctors and nurses which Cooney assembled was highly skilled, ensuring the babies got the best care available in America at that time. Well, very interesting, and very interesting article overall. Now, let's get to the good part since we've looked at the baseline of what the mainstream tells us, and let's consider what's really going on with these incubator babies. What's really going on with this story? Why do we have all this attention on Dr. Cooney, and why did we review this article? We know that there are pieces of information that seem to be fact in the article, and what it seems to be happening is that Dr. Cooney is a lightning rod to draw our attention. Yet other pieces of information seem to be fact. The fact that there were numerous exhibitions for decades that showed these incubator babies. The fact that there seemed to be medical teams all across the country, because supposedly everybody who had a premature birth had to go through Dr. Cooney. There was nobody else. How does that make any sense? This is what we'd expect to see at the World's Fair exhibition, but this is what we actually see. Not a single incubator, but many incubators. Why do we see so many incubators when 1, 2, or 3 would be perfectly sufficient to showcase the capabilities of the equipment? Now, of course, we cover this by saying we want to show off babies. But that's the reality. They're not showing off the incubators. It's clear they're showing off the babies. Why are they showing off the babies? If you think about that and you think about what you see in this image, there are many infants and many incubators there for this little crowd of people to see. And it looks like we have a doctor who's given an overall account of what's going on to this little tour group, if you will. And we even see what appears to be a child there. What's the real story with these children? There's even accounts that there was a fire that endangered many of the babies, although they saved them all in the incubators at one of the World's Fairs in the 19-teens. And yet this didn't stop Dr. Cooney from doing this. What's the real situation with this? And why is this so ominous? The reality that there was a supposed labor shortage, especially in the Midwest of the United States, in the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. If that's true, then it seems there wasn't sufficient population to consider settling the rest of the United States. So what if these incubator babies are really babies that had been produced? And then that leads to additional questions. Well, where did these babies come from? And how were they able to bring so many of them in so quickly? It goes back to many different questions about the fact that we have photographic evidence that makes it very clear that they're not showcasing the incubators. They're showcasing the babies. And what was the true number of orphan train riders? We're told it's 250,000. Yet there seem to be indications that since it went on for so long, the number had to be much greater. What if there's a disparity in the number of babies who were in the incubators? We're told the number is 6,000, 8,000, but the article admits there's no way to know. Yet supposedly this was across the entire nation, this appeared in multiple world fairs, and this went on for decades. Do we really believe that number would only be 6,000 or 8,000, or could it be far more? Consider the original concept behind the incubator. They tell us that it was started and invented in the 19th century, and that prior to that, there was no way to care or save infants who were born prematurely. Well, was that its real intention? Or were these infants somehow produced in some areas that we don't know of? Or areas that remain secret to the general population? And then they were provided or transported to all of these locations at these World's Fairs and locations across what is now the United States for display and exhibition. Everyone always refers to the incubator babies of Coney Island, but it very much was not simply Coney Island. What exactly is that individual wearing right there? That does not seem like the attire I would expect to see somebody wearing in New York in the 19th, early 20th century. But perhaps one of you historians out there could correct me on what the proper attire was. It's an interesting picture, and it looks like we have 3 infants in that particular incubator. So what exactly is going on with that? Regardless, we understand that these incubators were everywhere. They were displayed everywhere. And there also seemed to be a lot of effort put into this. I also find it interesting that the sign here is a little bit more elaborate than what we typically see. And why does this picture seem strange? The actions of the people that are posing in this picture, and even the appearance of some of these people in this picture. Supposedly this is from the early 1900s. Based on the era of dress, that's what we'd think, and those are more the hats I would expect to see in the United States. Either the top hat, or the classic version of the Panama hat, or even the little Expedition Smokey Bear hat. What exactly are we looking at? The gentleman, I think, who's holding the baby looks really strange. And then back on the sign itself, there seemed to be a lot of effort put into advertising this. And of course, you don't just see incubators. They weren't showcasing the equipment. They were showcasing the babies with the living infants. It seems as though this was designed to provide a selection or another alternative for labor and for repopulation. And we have many pictures like this. If these were the original mothers of these children, why would they ever allow them to be displayed like this? Even if Dr. Cooney had saved them. It just doesn't seem to match what we know of basic human social activity, or the bond between a mother and the child. This almost seems like these are people who came and they were looking for children to pick up. They picked out their children, and then they adopted them. We look at the many postcards and the images of the Cabbage Patch. And what's really the origin behind that? We're told that this is because people were uncomfortable about talking about such things as human reproduction in the 19th and the early 20th century, and so they used the Cabbage Patch and the stork to explain it. However, it seems as though there's a much more ominous meaning behind it. The reality behind the Cabbage Patch, that this was a way that they were simply providing children when they needed to repopulate the area. And that the true process was a family, a couple, or who knows, perhaps even people who hadn't even gotten married yet, went around, looked at children in the incubators, and selected them. And this image is especially ominous because here we have the children riding on a train. All the symbolism being depicted in this postcard. It seems like it's very benign and joyful. However, when we look at it for what it truly represents and what it could represent, it takes on a very different meaning. The great difficulty in accepting the fact that this could be the reality of the existence of many lineages. And none of us wanted to accept that or even consider it. But what if it's even more ominous that they were redesigning humans? We have far too many accounts of giants in our history and our myth, and supposedly some have even claimed to have discovered giants' bones, although these finds are always contested and considered quote-unquote pseudoscience. And yet there's many historical records beyond myth of giants. Even Roman Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who was a historical figure, and based on the actual conversion of the Roman measurement, he would be 8 feet 6 inches tall. And that's not beyond the realm of consideration because we have had human beings that have gotten over 8 feet tall that have been documented. Yet other evidence exists for even larger human beings. So what if the children from these incubators were redesigned human beings, either with some sort of process concerning DNA or some sort of scientific process that we don't understand? Also consider that in the Bible, the decline in ages at death. You look far enough back in the Bible, and other religious texts, of course, and it seems there are well-documented cases of human beings living over 800 years. Yet as time went on, for some reason, the lifespan or life expectancy decreased immensely, down to 200 years. And what can we say it is now? 80? 85 if you're lucky? Depending where you live, of course, we'll be told that there's a different life expectancy depending on nation, although what that has to do with it, I'm not sure. Yet that's what we're told. But what if the real answer, the potential changes in our human structure and our human lifespan, have to do with the actual redesigning of the human being? Perhaps through some process of alchemy that we don't understand, or some other scientific process that we're never going to be allowed to understand. It's a chilling consideration, And it's one of the reasons that this is a difficult topic to cover. Yet we have a lot of evidence and a lot of accounts that indicate this may be the case. Think of the channel's exploration into the underground. When we think of the existing population of the civilization that came before ours, Tartaria, or call it whatever you want to, and the many bones that we have underground indicating that millions were killed. Somebody died down there, and then somebody arranged the bones like that, indicating there was some mass killing that occurred. We have many difficult terms for it now. And then we also consider the images that we have of different types of humans or human-like creatures, such as the blimmies. Were they the result of some sort of genetic manipulation or tampering or alteration? And then, of course, there are many other creatures. And then we wonder even about the very plain disparity that we have in human beings today. Compared to this, the differences in human beings today is very, very minor. Also, when you take accounts in of other creatures that supposedly existed. Also, going back to the giants, here's Robert Wadlow from Alton, Illinois. Guinness Book of World Records is the tallest human being. The picture in the middle, some people contest saying it's fake, and yet that individual who appears to be in that coffin looks about to be as tall as Robert Wadlow. And then what about the skeleton to the right? Is that real, or is that an altered image? Things suddenly become a lot more cloudy when we consider this, and we consider these conflicting accounts. Robert Wadlow was very well documented. What about the rest of this? What about the myths and the stories that we have of different human beings in the past? And what about the myths and the stories that we have of giants and of people having much longer lifespans? There's too many accounts of this to simply ignore. Of course, our mainstream will address this by saying that no, everything we tell you is true. There were dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and that's not absurd. And yes, they were tremendously large creatures, and they lived on the land. So we can't use that old excuse that, well, we only have large creatures in the water, such as the blue whale, because that facilitates large creatures in the water. But we'll justify this by saying things were very different in the environment, and that's what facilitated the lifespan of large creatures such as these, with the size and mass that you couldn't possibly imagine. And isn't it funny how much we remember in school the way that they pushed dinosaurs on us, and even in fiction to this day, and science fiction being mixed with it. And we'll be told that this is a picture of an individual next to a dinosaur bone. But are we sure it's a dinosaur bone, or could that be a bone of anything, or could it be something else entirely? Remember that we just have a picture here. So what does this really tell us about these incubator babies? It seems clear that there was some more nefarious purpose by displaying all of these infants in all these different locations. Were they just displaying infants that you could select as part of a repopulation plan at a national or potentially international level? Who knows how widespread this was? Or were they introducing an altered human being into the existing population stocks? Can't really disprove that. Can't really prove it either. However, they're very interesting considerations. What do you think is really going on? Let me know in the comments. We're going to continue this exploration, and we're going to try to answer the questions, whether it's through theory and conjecture based on available evidence, of how the situation came to be. Where did these babies come from? Where did the orphans on the orphan trains come from? And how did we end up in this situation after the last reset, whether it occurred in 1850 or a year that was much earlier? There's much more exploration that we have to complete, and we will, with the 19th century and understanding how the situation came to be, and looking for explanations of what happened to the civilization before us, and how the reset was so effective. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for today's exploration into the date paradox. What year is it? Today we're going to be examining the current year. Is it really the year that we think it is? This will be the first theory video for many of our new viewers, although it's been some time for are experienced viewers since we've done a theory video. The point of a theory video is to give the baseline for the channel in all future explorations. And we're going back to the very major theories. What are the major theories and thesis statement for our explorations to determine the existence of Tartaria in the Old World? Let's examine the first three. Our first three theories are humanity has experienced 5 ages or eras of time. Theory 2, there was an era of a very different land. And Theory 3, we are living in a simulation. All of our explorations are designed to determine if these theories are valid or if they're not valid. All 6 of these theories are considered simultaneously in every exploration, although we tend to have the most objective evidence for Theory 1. Now, many people will no doubt debate that, but when we look at all of our explorations and the evidence that we find on the ground, we see that there is evidence that there was a previous civilization. We see that there's evidence that there may have been a very different shape to the land. Perhaps the large mesas are old trees. Perhaps Devil's Tower is an old tree. And there is megaflora and fauna that remains integrated into the land. However, our most consistent theories tend to be looking at the buildings and determining the 5 eras. We also have other theories that we may be living in a dream, or we consider the theory that history is exactly as it's told to us. There's never been any mistakes, there's never been any missing time, everything is exactly as we want it to be. But we have to wonder if that is indeed the situation, or if it's something else entirely. A combination of these theories is also possible. We consider the 5 eras theory as the most likely because that's what we see most of the evidence pointing to. The 5 eras being divided up into 3 overall periods, one being the Golden Age, which consists of the first 3 eras in the distant past. We have the 4th era, or what we call the Tartarian Age, or the Monument Age, or whatever civilization preceded ours. And finally we have the Contemporary Age, which is our current era. A lot of our explorations focus on the time frame of either 1850, 1800, or 1750. And these are the suspected time frames for when the last reset occurred. The reason this is such a challenge, though, is in order to go off of these dates and these years, we have to take exactly what we're told about our calendar at face value, or for granted. The challenge is that since we question the existence of our narrative and what aspects go into it, we have to realize that our understanding of the date system could be completely wrong. We believe that it's the year 2023, and our calendar is based upon the existence of a religious figure. However, there are many other calendar systems based on other religious figures or based on other critical events. We also have to remember that there were civilizations that did precede ours according to the mainstream account, and yet we have to remember why it's important to ask questions. Remember that when we have simply a picture, different historical accounts can be assigned to it. The picture of the Union Station in Kansas City. 3 different accounts. Dedication ceremony, amazing buildings that took years to complete. Dedication of a major monument across the road. Or it's a large group of refugees from a war-torn land celebrating their arrival. And any one of these accounts could be presented and could be believed. Merely a year after the event occurred, it would not take very long. And as more time passed, more people would look back, and whatever account they were given, regardless of what truly transpired, that's the account they would believe. They would have an emotional attachment to it. They do not ask questions, and therefore it becomes their reality. This is why it's important for us to ask questions when we do these explorations. This is a very intense process, because we have to consider what happens if you alter the 5 W's and the timeline. The 5 W's being who, what, where, when, and why. And let's consider this in detail and how someone could alter the 5 W's and therefore alter our timeline or our perception of the timeline. Because if you change the 5 W's, and you don't have to change all of them, you may only have to change 1 or 2, and you can change the how. Let's look at this example, major indicators of truth. Here's what really happened. Destruction of many cities on the same day. Worldwide conflict occurring in 4 to 5 years. Vast displacement of total population, again within 4 to 5 years. It may have happened in 1850, it may have happened in 1800, it may have happened in some year we have no idea what year it is. How would we confuse the memory of what really happened? Well, let's start with the uniforms. Look at the United States Civil War. How many different uniforms were there for the Union and Confederate forces? For that matter, how many Union forces wore gray and how many Confederate forces wore blue? You might be surprised if you do your own research and find out exactly what history tells us. And that's always the difficulty with research. What are we really researching? We're researching someone else's account and someone else's research. And typically that's a fact that people don't look into, or they take it for granted. Now let's look at some more pictures. And look at these pictures. We can assign a year and an event to all of these. 1872, it was a fire. 1854, a fire. 1906, an explosion. 1864, General Sherman marched through and destroyed the city. 1840 to 1920, immigration. And you can imagine other photos, the Industrial Revolution, any time frame that you really want. You can really throw any year with any event, with any photo, and you can paint any sort of picture you want to. These events may have all happened on the same day, but if you assign different years to them, we've changed the when, and suddenly we've confused the how. How did all this happen? When did it happen? Who was involved? You don't have to change all the 5 W's and you can suddenly paint a very different narrative. The point behind this illustration is to show you how easy this could be accomplished. And remember, when people repeat things over and over again, they tend to accept that as fact. They have an emotional attachment to it. War, relocation, immigration, disaster, uncertainty. No one will ever question that. We have our years, we have our time frames, it's 2023. We know exactly when everything occurred. We learned history, we studied it, we repeated it, we researched it. And many people will tell you that. Well, you don't do very good research. You must be moronic because you're not accepting everything at face value. Your chronology of events is completely wrong. How could you possibly question any of this? And yet, that's the very core of the research that we do, and that's why it's very challenging. And now let's look into a very confusing aspect of it. We have many gravestones that have strange designations on them. Some with a letter, either a J or an I, and then a 3-digit number typically. Is that really indicating the year? How common is this phenomena? And as we zoom in, you see J797, it looks like. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean it's the year 797? Is there some other designation that's associated with that we don't fully understand? And here we see it on this gravestone, J777. Is the year 777? Does the J mean something else? Does it represent 1,000 years? That's what we would think. We would think if we see a J or if we see an I, a Roman numeral 1. What does it mean? Why does this have such confusion for researchers when we're trying to look at this? Well, we have to remember right now we're just actually looking at pictures of these headstones. We're not actually looking at the real headstones. Now you can go out and if you look hard enough, you'll find some headstones that actually say this and you'll see it with your own eyes. But if you do, what exactly does it mean? Does this prove anything? Well, I'll tell you exactly what it proves. Right now, you're looking at a picture of a headstone with this designation on it. If you go out and you look at the real headstone, then you're going out and you're looking at a real headstone with the letter and the numeric designation on it. However, even if you go out there and you really see that, what does that prove? I will tell you exactly what it proves. That someone at some time inscribed this on this headstone, J789. Does this prove anything else, even if you're really standing there, really looking at it? The answer is no. It does not prove anything. And you may be asking, why? Why doesn't it prove anything? I told you exactly what it proves. Someone inscribed that in that headstone. Now, did they have a reason for it? We don't know. Could they have been reflecting a year or some other number for some other reason? Quite possibly. We just don't know, unless we actually talk to the person who inscribed that headstone. And we see official accounts from expeditionary armies in the distant past. And yet you notice the same anomaly. 3-digit years. Well, does that mean that this is the year? And you're looking at an account from a British expeditionary force, and we know that the British Army has a reputation for being very thorough in its record keeping. So why would they write this? The British Army, as we know it, certainly didn't exist in 804. What exactly does this mean? Or could this simply be a shorthand? Maybe they just left out the one because it was so obvious and they were just trying to save space. Or perhaps that was the military standard that they wrote orders or dates or kept records by. Unless we could actually ask the person, we don't know. And we may have accounts that tell us what their standards are, but we have to question that, especially if this is a couple hundred years ago. And you'll see more examples on it, not just from the United States or the United Kingdom, but in other portions of the world. Russia, Eastern Europe, Africa. We also have to remember there's a difference between Arabic and Roman numerals. And keep that in mind because we're going to explore that in great detail. But just with Arabic numerals, where perhaps we shouldn't see Arabic numerals, we see the same phenomena of 3 digits and what looks to be a month. What exactly is going on? Does this really prove that there is something with our dating system or our calendar? Well, we have to remember that even from our own perception, we have so many different calendars. We have so many different dating systems. What exactly does that say? What is that indicating? What do you think? Is that a year? Is that a date designation? Or is that some other number entirely? Those are always the details that we have to remember when we attempt to do this kind of research. And we don't just have this on headstones and military orders, but we even see this on coins. And here you see the more traditional I, or the 1, or the Roman I, which coincidentally also means 1, if you're going off of Roman numerals. So you see how this account gets even more confused looking at coins from the past. Is it 1736? Is it I-736? Does it really mean a 1, or is it an I? Because there's also different designations for how this I or this 1 are drawn. Is it Arabic numerals, or is it Roman numerals? You see how with so many different languages and so many different interpretations, just looking at 4 digits alone, we can come to many different conclusions. And some have even speculated that this could be yet another manner in which to confuse us in terms of what actual year it is. The challenge we have is we have to go off a baseline event. And the baseline event is the year that your society or civilization's calendar system started in. For example, looking at this coin. Is that a I-621? Is that a 1621? Well, just looking at it, you could interpret it as 1621, and you would assume that this coin was minted in 1621. Was it? That 1 looks different than that I. Can you really tell just looking at it? Or does looking at it simply raise more questions? And again, we go back to that question, you're looking at the image, but what if you were really holding the coin in your hand? What does it prove? Well, it proves that someone minted that. But what we have to consider when we look at old coins, old headstones, old written orders, maybe there was some other purpose, or maybe something else was designated. We have to be careful not to see what it is we want to see. And that's one of the most challenging aspects of this research, because it is very alluring. And that is why the greatest challenge is remaining objective. And believe me, there are many people out there that will become very emotional just because of the fact that you're simply asking questions. Because remember, they've had this narrative repeated to them their entire lives. US coin, is that a J? Is that an I? 783? What exactly does that mean? Could it be possible that there was another year, or another system, or, as we said, another baseline event that this dating system was set on? Or does this number have absolutely nothing to do with dating? Interesting other side of this coin as well, with the good old all-seeing eye. And by all means, in the comments, let me know what you think. I mean, we could interpret these as years. That's what we want to see, and that's what we expect to see on our coins. Yet if you look at old Roman coins, you'll see that they didn't put any year on it, which is rather strange. And what year would the Romans have put on their coins anyway? You would think their baseline event year would have been the founding of their empire. Now I ask you to consider the example of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989 movie, the last movie in the original Indiana Jones trilogy. And in my humble opinion, probably should have been left at that. There was a scene where Indy was going through the 3 challenges to reach the Holy Grail towards the end of the film, and he had to spell the name of God, Jehovah. And in the scene, he has a big J right in front of him, and then an I just past the J, to the upper left as you look at it. Well, thinking in English, Jehovah begins with a J, he steps on the J, and his foot goes right through it. And as he's hanging there dangling for his life, because the ground gives away, he suddenly says to himself, "Yes, in Latin, Jehovah begins with an I." And then he pulls himself back up and he steps on the I. It's something important to consider because there are different alphabets and there are different languages. And how many different languages there are in the lands right now, or in the realm, is certainly subject to debate. You can do your old Google search because we know all the answers are there, right? And it may tell you one day there's 7,000 languages, there's 8,000 languages. It's safe to say there are many different languages, many different pronunciations, and then we even factor in older languages, such as Latin, that aren't used anymore. So what conclusions and theories can we come to from this exploration? Well, let's recount and see what we have. The year may be anything, and we have no way to know for sure. Who says it's 2023? It could be any year. What's the baseline event? And how many years have passed? We may be able to piece together clues and estimate what year it truly is if we have the baseline event. And some researchers have made some progress in doing that, suggesting potentially that a number of years, 500 to 1,000 typically, are inserted into the timeline. But then that also accepts that the rest of the narrative that we're given is correct. And the only thing that's different is one set of years being inserted into it, whether it's 500 or 1,000. Consider the fact that I and J in years could mean a different baseline event. Perhaps J means in the year of our Lord. Perhaps I means something else entirely. In the year of the Imperium? Who knows? Or they're merely there to confuse the year or prevent us from learning it. And finally, it could be possible that it really is 2023. Our baseline event is as we understand it, and everything's perfectly accurate. And it doesn't matter that our nation, our government, our society, our civilization, or wherever you live in the lands, has been preceded by many other governments and many other societies that we've been told relentlessly are corrupt and could not keep an accurate calendar. Or if they did, the oftentimes insane rulers in power, because I'm sure we've all heard how insane Emperor Caligula was, that they didn't order a change in the calendar or just discarding years. Caligula, we're told, had his horse named as co-counsel. So why wouldn't he make a decree or dictate that he's going to change the calendar? We're not going to consider this 500 years in Roman history. I'm throwing them out. And if anybody refers to them, they will face immediate and instant execution. Think about that. And finally, think about why it would be so critical for someone to control this perception. What do you think? What year do you think it is, and what do you think's going on with our calendar, our dating system? Do you think it's completely accurate? Or do you think that there are many other potential theories, other possibilities for what year it is and what our baseline event is? Let me know in the comments. Your feedback could be very useful to trying to determine the results of this exploration and future explorations, because knowing what year it is critical, or so we think. Or does it really matter as much as we believe? Let me know. It's been so long since I've been on the channel. It's a joy to be here again. As you know, I, Carl Sagan, hosted Cosmos in 1980, the greatest public television show of all time. And I am here to look for your support in my latest endeavor. I believe that scientists should be recognized as politicians, military leaders, and others have been recognized through history. This absurd alternate history that you see on this channel should be stricken, and there should be a new monument built. Of course, with my face in the position of honor on the right, in the highest portion of this monument. And perhaps there'll be space for my closest acolyte. He will of course be next to me on the left. His contributions in the present are suitable, but nowhere near as great as mine. And perhaps we have room for some other scientific contributors who will go on this monument I have long desired to have a great monument that will show the greatness of science, and of course highlight my scientific contributions to planet Earth. We will call it Mount Star Stuff. This is a model, but I want this to be a reality. But I was thinking, why do I have to stop with one monument? Perhaps there are other monuments that I could use, or other monuments that could inspire building monuments of me. Think on it. How wonderful would it be to see my face in monuments everywhere, across the land? People would come from far and wide to glean upon my wise and fatherly face, and they will always seek guidance from me in the future, knowing that I'm the greatest scientist that ever lived, and not forgetting that I hosted Cosmos in 1980. Its success was not based on its soundtrack. Its success was based on my wondrous personality. And monuments could be across the world. All over the globe, you would see my face. And you would know what an important individual I am. Future generations will remember that Carl Sagan hosted Cosmos, and that he boldly led humanity into its future. And even as my memory engrams persist on the Voyager spacecraft, people will remember Carl Sagan. Future generations will see him. Because remember that even tyrants and indigenous people always appreciate science. And they recognize how important science is. And looking everywhere and seeing my face where it properly belongs, you will understand that we are a civilization that is based on science. And look how far science has carried us. And look everywhere across the globe and revel in my greatness. I have long dreamed of this moment, and I think it should become a reality. Oh, and keep looking up. You stole that from Jack Horkheimer, Carl. Well, in any event, it's been a long dream of mine. And what do you think of my plan? What do you think of monuments across the globe?
I don't find it silly at all. And erect a gigantic monument to RoboCop, the cyborg of self